This happened to me back in 2008 when I was 14, so my memory is a little fuzzy. My mom, brother, and I drove deep into the sticks of Tennessee from Texas to visit. We were only staying for the weekend. My mom, aunt, and grandmother were talking, and I don't know how we got to this conversation, but my aunt was telling me how she heard about this abandoned church that was supposedly haunted. If you went to the church and took the stick that kept the door closed and put it somewhere else, when you came back, it would be in its original place. There was a statue of an angel, and if you shined a light in its eyes at night, they would bleed. She was spending the night at a friend's house, and her friend also had another friend over that she wasn't familiar with. Her two friends decided to go out to this church at night, in the early hours of the morning. It was pitch black because it's out in the country. They lay a Ouija board on the truck and start asking questions. Basically, some spirit named John says that he was murdered by a gunshot some year in the early 1800s. I swear in this town there are more dead people than there are alive people. I don't actually know that, but it sure seems like it. The last question that they asked was, "Where are you?" and the planchette flew off the board. They decided they didn't want to look for it. Part of me wonders if it's still at the church and where it would be. So they checked the gravestones nearby and found John. Then they thought that they heard a gunshot and ran back to the truck and went home. I said I wanted to go to the church. She took me, my brother, and my cousin who were the same age. It was about a 45-minute drive to get there, and the road that it was on was empty, nothing but grass. There was no way that you could walk there. Across the street was a field that went on for miles, and on either side of the church was just grass and trees. No streetlights. So when we get there, it's a one-room, white little church. It's surrounded by trees toward the outside of the fence. The fence was black iron, and the opening was big enough for trucks to come through. We saw the creepy angel statue that my aunt had mentioned. We thought it looked like the Reaper. We pull up, and the gate is already open. Immediately, my brother and my cousin, who were in the back seat, were like, "Oh no, we are not going in there." And my aunt was saying, "Why is the gate open? I just don't understand." And I had my hand on the handle, and I looked at the gate. And I knew that something was waiting for me on the other side. I could see, maybe my mind made it up, but I didn't see it with my physical eyes. A ghostly white man with yellow, crooked teeth maliciously smiling at me. So I take my hand off the handle and say, "Okay, I want to go home." So my aunt backed out and went down the road a little bit further, and the closest thing next to us to turn around at, because there were little ditches on the side of the road in case it rains, was another graveyard. Not surprising. We passed by the church, and I wasn't expecting her to stop, but she did to take a photo with a digital camera, and the door was open to the church. We were all freaked out, and I swear I had this feeling like we needed to leave because something was going to chase us. When we got home, the three of us couldn't stop looking at the camera. The thing I remembered the most was that the treetops grew into a face. It looked like a big bald man with a crooked nose and a narrow chin. When my aunt got the picture developed, there were 4 orbs. 1 by the gate, 1 by the door, and 2 by the window. My brother and cousin swore that they had seen green eyes looking out of that window. I didn't sleep that night. I felt like something was hovering over me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I kept praying that nothing would happen. I tried watching TV to shake it off, but damn, there was no shaking it. I didn't sleep until I got back to Texas. That was my last night in Tennessee, and when I went back home, I slept with my light on every night for a while. And while we were there, I could just sense this unbelievable amount of hate from whatever was there. It was so aggressive and ready to attack. That feeling just pierced through you. That's my only experience. I will never doubt that there is a spirit world after that. My aunt sent me the picture, but I tore it up in 2012 because I was afraid that it would bring something bad into the house. I have a few stories that I can't explain, but this is the one that I feel I need to share because it happens to align with a type of experience that so many people have reported throughout the years, arguably since ancient times. I'd always been certain of what I saw, but when I first became aware of shadow people as a commonly reported phenomena, any doubt that I had about the incident disappeared. So many people have tried to tell me that what I experienced was just a dream or simply brushed it off with that look that says this guy is either nuts or lying. And honestly, it's time that people start taking victims of paranormal visitation at their word. In an age where we're starting to wake up to the fact that victims of all forms of abuse deserve a voice and representation, it's sad to see that so many people are disregarded as mentally ill or confused just because their experience lacks an accredited scientific explanation. My experience was not as extreme as some that I've heard from others on various paranormal forums and podcasts, but it has affected my life in a number of ways, and to have the source of so many anxieties and frustration in your life disregarded as a dream or a fiction leaves a person feeling very alone, unable to really explore their trauma, because the subject is so taboo and very few people are willing to take your account seriously and help you search for answers. This is my story. And I assure you, I have nothing to gain by bringing you a false account. I just want to put my testimony out there so that other experiencers can know that they are not alone and that they are, probably at least, not crazy. There are things in this life that do not yet have a scientific explanation, and humanity is not the only sentient intelligence that operates in this world. Beyond that, I really don't know a damn thing. But accepting the fact is the first step in beginning to fully understand the nature of this world, or any others that may exist. The first time I saw it, I was about 8, maybe as old as 10. I was living in a dingy little house in Clear Lake, Iowa, in what you would consider to be the trashier part of a small tourist town. My room was at the end of a long hallway, on the right side of the hall if you were looking toward it from the kitchen on the opposite end. Across the hall, the left side, was my toddler sister's room, and in the middle of the hall on the left was the door to my parents' room. One morning I got out of bed and started to move toward the kitchen. When I was just about at my parents' door, looking toward the kitchen, the figure appeared. It sort of leaned into the hall from the living room, which was adjacent to the kitchen. It was a tall, black figure. Black as in pitch black, but sort of smoky and hazy, like it was just a bunch of compressed black smoke molded into a human form. Everyone seemed tall to me as a kid, but this thing certainly seemed taller than my parents, who were about 5'5" and 5'6" respectively. The only distinguishable feature on the being were that it had 2 glowing red eyes, just like circular LEDs, on its face. They didn't really seem to be the size and shape that a human eye really is, but truly round and glowing very brightly. This detail I'm sort of fuzzy on, but that's what I recall. From the moment it leaned into view, the thing was just watching me, and when I saw it, I stopped and watched it back. I wasn't exactly scared, but had the distinct impression that this was all it was there to do. To watch. I knew that this wasn't something that I should be seeing in the real world, and I was uncomfortable, but all in all, the thing was non-threatening and didn't make any advancements on me. It just stood there for a minute or two, and then leaned back out into the living room. I didn't follow it to see if it had disappeared. I just went back to my room until my parents woke up. I never, quote-unquote, woke up from this experience. My day progressed seamlessly into a normal day. I knew that this was not a dream because I was very familiar with my dreams. I had constant night terrors in this house, but I'll get into that later on. The point being, the kinds of dreams that I had were more distinctly bizarre and surreal than this experience, and I always woke up with an understanding that what I had experienced that night was just a dream. This was not the case that morning. If I was dreaming that morning, then I'm still dreaming, because like I said, I never woke up from it. The second experience was just as brief, but a bit more menacing. I can't say how much time passed between the two events, but this incident was dead in the middle of the day, full daylight with other people in the house going about their daily business. My mother was in the living room, and I had just walked into the kitchen and toward the hall. I was now standing approximately where the figure had been on the first occasion, looking down toward my room and my sister's. Suddenly, the figure appeared. This is where it gets really bizarre, because the thing actually crept out of my room. I mean, this effing thing was literally creeping, like some old school Scooby-Doo villain walking on tiptoes with its arms raised and hands bent toward the floor. If you get what I'm illustrating here, you should probably laugh, because it was just as goofy as it sounds. It crept from my room into my sister's room, which is what really freaked me out by this event. The whole thing was over in just a few seconds. Moving in this bizarre manner, it had its head turned toward me the entire time. From the moment that it crossed the threshold of my door, its eyes were already on me, as if to say, "Yeah, I'm here, straight creeping around your house, and there's nothing you can do about it. No one's gonna believe you." I had already told my mom about the first sighting, and of course she had dismissed it as a dream or my overactive imagination. So I didn't bring it up, but I was really scared that it had some sinister intentions with my sister. I do remember her having some nightmares around this time, which I heard from my room, her crying to my mom about how the quote-unquote creature from the Black Lagoon was standing in the corner of her room. I asked her about this years later, but she doesn't remember any details on that. So that's it. That's all I saw of this shadow person. But there's another element to my life at this house that I feel might be relevant to what I experienced. As I mentioned earlier, I was prone to night terrors while living in this house. Vivid but bizarre nightmares that almost always had something to do with being chased by various demons, monsters, etc. One recurring type of dream I had went like this. I'd be laying in my bed, everything seeming to be completely normal in my room, as it was in waking life, but I would get this feeling. It was this instinctual understanding that something horrible was about to come through my door. I would start to panic, but would be unable to move my body, so rather than use my arms and legs to physically leave my bed, I would, through a sheer force of will, hover off of my bed and float to the corner of the ceiling, as out of reach as possible. Nothing else was really different about my room in these experiences except for that dread. The dread that something was trying to get in. Another night I had a similar dream, where I woke up in my familiar room to find a tall, hairy man standing above me, reaching for me. I had the strong sense that this skinny, ape-like man was there to take me, and I recall doing my best to resist him, but the ending to that dream is fuzzy. That scares me to this day, more than the shadow person encounters, because the hairy men are a pretty common occurrence in high strangeness research, so I can't help but worry that there was some reality to that experience. I bring these dreams up because it seems that vivid nightmares in certain locations, this happened only in that house, that also have reported paranormal activity, indicates a relationship between the two. If you subscribe to the idea that these beings feed off of fear, then it seems plausible that the two are connected. I have had 2 premonitions up to now. Both happened in 1992, a long time ago, but a year full of disasters in the Netherlands. In both dreams, I was standing in front of a window, observing the disaster unfolding. These dreams were also so vivid that I can still remember them in clear detail. The first one was that suddenly, I was in an office looking outside overlooking a chemical factory. I immediately knew that it was the Sindhu factory nearby. Suddenly, one of the reactor vessels exploded, setting the whole of the factory into flames. A few days later, on July 8, 1992, it did indeed happen. A trainee operator used the wrong recipe for the process. The reactor vessel overheated. The company brigade started cooling the vessel down, but to no avail. The vessel exploded. One of the valves was found 2 kilometers away. The 3 firemen died, and 11 other employees were injured, of which 1 had very severe burns. A few months later, at the end of September in 1992, suddenly I again had a vivid dream of standing in front of a window, this time at the Zilmer area in the southeast of Amsterdam. I saw military planes dropping bombs on a block of apartments. In the early evening of October 4th, 1992, an El Al cargo Boeing took off from Amsterdam Airport, heading to Tel Aviv. Just after takeoff, the captain notified traffic control that they had lost power in 2 engines and requested to return. What he didn't know was that he not only lost power in these engines, he physically lost the 2 engines. I think that they were actually the bombs that I thought I saw falling. The captain had very big troubles in controlling the airplane. He made some circles go up to the point that he could not hold the plane anymore, and it plunged almost nose down into the corner where 2 blocks of apartments met. It left a burning hole of rubble, 8 stories over a length of about 10 apartments, gone. The death toll was 43, of which 4 were aboard the plane. I have since then not had these kinds of dreams anymore. Maybe because both disasters happened within a radius of less than 10 kilometers from where I lived back then. This happened 2 years ago, August 11th of 2018. And since the anniversary just passed, I thought I would finally share this story. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about half an hour from where we live. For reference, my fiancé is black. We live in a predominantly white, conservative, and racist area. This is important later. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the exact same plot the year before. Needless to say, we were familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. The first night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. Now, back to the main event. On August 11th, we spent the day at the battlefields a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for the day by my fiancé as a surprise for me while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening, about 6 p.m., before heading back to our camp. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been inside of our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the ground, and my backpack had been rearranged, and I was missing underwear. But hey, we were stupid 19-year-old kids and decided that since whoever had busted in had left and hadn't taken anything important, that it was fine and they wouldn't come back. So we set up a campfire and set out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes, and celebrating our engagement. Around 9:30 p.m. we put out our fire and decided to go into our tent for the night to celebrate a little more. Nothing too loud or obnoxious. Immediately after we finished, we started to hear the noises outside of our tent again, but this time we focused in. We heard clear footsteps and at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking around right outside. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps, and we heard whispering again. Make that 2 men walking around our tent. As if we had telepathic abilities, my fiancé said, "I have to go to the bathroom," and I agreed. The bathroom was up the hill from our site. Most people who were in lower sites like ours drove their cars up to the bathroom. Now here is the part that I still get chills to think about. We got up and were getting dressed. My fiancé had just turned on the light in our tent when a man spoke directly to us from right outside. "What are you doing?" he asked. I can't even describe how malicious and menacing this voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of the tent. Allow me to reiterate that we were stupid 19-year-old kids, so we decided to just make a run for it to the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped outside. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell. I heard the footsteps running behind us, and then turning and running up to another campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We debated sleeping in the car or driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed up in 5 minutes and hopped into the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the drive to grab our nameplate, which had my full name on it, off of the post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time. Stalking through the woods onto our campsite were 2 tall, white men. I realized that these were the same men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us and muttering to each other. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other one was wearing a Confederate flag tank top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car driving away, and one started to make chase until the other one stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifyingly evil smile at me and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest-to-follow roads, and called my dad so that he would know we were coming. When we got there, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us just being paranoid. So I never told anyone else besides all of you just now. I am convinced to this day that that was going to be a racially motivated attack. The campground was not heavily populated, and my fiancé was the only non-white person at any of the campsites. It was no accident that the 2 men who had been shadowing us since our arrival and wore Confederate flags and had one on their truck decided to target the interracial couple. I still get cold chills when I think about how close we were to being killed or seriously hurt that night, and just how lucky we were that our reckless plan to just make a run for it actually worked. So to those men who stalked our campsite with the hunting knives, let's not meet again. A few years ago, I was still in high school, and out of my own curiosity, I tried to lucid dream. I started recording dreams for a month as soon as I woke up. I had all of them written out on a big notepad, but I never really got it to work. Anyway, one night I had a dream where a friend came to me right before I woke up, and the only thing that happened was him telling me something bad is gonna happen soon. A few days later, I completely forgot about this, but the same friend in real life keeps acting really just down in the dumps. I asked him what's wrong, and he said it's just a bummer because his uncle had a heart attack and he's worried about him. To add to it, I get a call later that day telling me that my uncle also had a heart attack on the same day and died. At that point, I had to break this weird story to him. Premonition, or just pretty creepy coincidence? He believes the story, even though I would have been skeptical. So this actually happened at the beginning of June, and after some meetings with the cops, I've decided to share it here. It's been a small tradition for me to go quote-unquote camping in my backyard every summer for a few weeks or so. Our yard is 6 acres, and part of it is a small wooded area next to our pond. You can't see the road directly, but you can see the cars passing by if you look well enough. Anyways, since it was a nice area, I set up a small 2-person tent, and the first few nights went really well. A few mosquito bites here and there, but apart from the bugs at the pond, there was nothing too bad. It was the 6th night when it happened. That night I wanted to stay up late and make a small fire in the fire pit to roast marshmallows and all that, simply because I could. I did it all, and now it was 2 a.m. I was walking back to the hill to get up to the wooded area when I looked out over the pond and saw a figure just standing there. I couldn't tell if it was actually looking at me or not, and honestly thought that it was just one of our small pine trees next to the road. Looking around, there was a car parked on the side of the road, turned off. The moonlight helped me see the car's silhouette. At first, I shrugged it off a bit, trying to think rationally about it, because I wanted to go to bed. I called out. No answer. I turned to my side and decided it was all too scary for me and wanted to sleep inside tonight. But then I saw the figure start to move as well. I put 2 and 2 together and then ran towards my house and right into it and locked the back door. It was left unlocked in case I needed to go in. This person was just halfway across the backyard when I locked the door. They were hella fast to get around that pond so quickly. I ran and woke up my parents. My dad got his loaded handgun that he kept in the small safe on his nightstand. I called the police, and my mom went to check on my other siblings upstairs. My dad went out to look for the man, and I stayed on the porch, watching him go off into the yard. By that point, I couldn't see the man, or see far enough to know if the car was still there or not. My dad was shouting a lot, and I couldn't see him very well when he got to the edge of the forest. He was coming back when I saw the car's headlights turn on, and it skidded away with squealing tires. When the cops arrived, he was long gone, and the most description that I could give was a man about 6 foot tall and fast. The next week went by with some investigations around our property, and quite frankly, with lack of description or evidence, much more than some tire tracks, I'm assuming they haven't found anyone. They said they would call me if they did, but at this point, I really don't think they will. My dad is now thinking of putting up some fence along the back road, and I've been staying inside most of the time. So, creepy man in our backyard, let's not meet again. I have a story from about 2 years ago that really captivates me to this day. When I've told this story to close friends, they tell me it's straight out of a movie. I can't really disagree with that. This starts when I finished my first year of college in the Bay Area. I worked my ass off in school, and I just wanted to have a wild summer, and I would do anything I could to get out of the house. My cousin was and is my best friend, and we basically did anything and everything together. When there wasn't anything to do, we'd take walks together around my rural neighborhood. I always lived near this old hospital, which used to operate as the biggest trauma unit in my area. Sometime when I was in high school, they shut the hospital down for some reason that I still don't know. It basically just sat there rotting for a few years before we found it. One day we were drinking a cold one and taking one of our routine walks and ventured away from our usual route through this peaceful, random field. We stumbled across this huge parking lot after making it out of the field, but it didn't hit me that this was the old hospital's parking lot that we had found. We made our way through the lot until we saw this massive building standing on the outside. The deteriorated banner said emergency room, and this was when we knew we had struck gold and stumbled across a back route to this abandoned hospital. We knew of this place, but we had never been here. We hadn't heard any weird, outlandish urban legends, nor had anyone that we knew been here before us. We pushed forward and checked out the perimeter. To our surprise, the first door we walked up to had a rock jammed in between the door frames so that we could just waltz right in. This was when it occurred to us that it could be a potentially bad idea if we got caught, and we could suffer some consequences. We agreed we would be quiet and respectful and make it a quick trip. This is where things take a turn. Or a few turns. We entered the building and it was the most deafening quiet that I had ever experienced. The sound of the door closing was like a literal bomb going off. Once the echo stopped from the door, it dawned on us that this place was straight up creepy. We walked slowly, but the floor is covered in glass, which makes even the smallest of steps sound like Bigfoot lumbering around a library. We found a patient room, which still had a bed inside. We stopped at the doorway to look in because the floor looked sketchy. Out of nowhere, from around the corner, we heard the faintest, slow, drawn-out whistling. I've never in my life stopped what I was doing so suddenly. I just stared wide-eyed at my cousin because even a whisper sounds like yelling in this place. We both have our feet planted to the ground, because if we move, then we too will make ourselves known. At this point, we both assumed there could potentially be a squatter or a guard of some sort. My cousin hand gestures to me that we have to leave and we can't just stand here because the whistling was obviously not going to stop. We turn toward the opposite of the corner that the whistling is at, and we're tiptoeing to a perfect silence. Then the whistling stopped. We freeze again, and we hear the glass crunching from around the corner. We start running. Once we get to the door we came from, we realize we didn't put a fucking rock in the door frame when we came in, and now the door is completely stuck. As we were trying to get this door open, the glass crunching is now running. We hear it until it sounds like it is dangerously close. I am horrified. We turn around to try another door and the noise of the glass is literally right in front of us, yet no one is there. No one. We book it to a door that says pharmacy and peel the door open. The pharmacy is completely empty except a single, perfectly placed and aligned landline phone plugged into the wall. The phone is off the hook and making a dial tone. The whole thing is so perfectly lined up and centered with the whole room, I've never seen anything like it. And the dial tone was so loud in such an empty place. There wasn't power throughout the hospital, so how was it working? I was in complete shock. We left and never went back. I had heard of some other kids going there at night. They told me that they also heard the whistling and thought someone was lurking in the shadows the whole time. It is a freaky world out there. This event happened to me last summer. It was probably the scariest story from my life, and I wanted to share it so hopefully someone learns from it. Something I've realized growing up, year by year, is that this world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately, I've seen that side of our world firsthand. I'm a very social person and love the opportunity to hang out with friends whenever I get the chance. I'm also the type of person who's always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you that I was an 18-year-old male at the time of this story and have a decent-sized friend group both of boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy shit together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane before departing for college. We all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days. Fun, right? And by some miracle, all of our parents thought that it would be fine. So we had 6 people along. Me, my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Steve and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple, for reasons that you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware of everything that we needed to survive for those 3 days. Food, water, and other essential supplies. Being rebellious teenagers, we also stocked up on plenty of booze and weed for our fun getaway. So mid-July we depart for our camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually find a place that looks secluded enough, but not too sketchy like some horror stories. There were houses nearby, but not that close. Again, we weren't looking for a sketchy wooded area, but unfortunately there was no cell phone service. It took us at least an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished with everything, Brandon and I took a look around the camp while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't very concerned because there was a house within a mile radius and we assumed that it was those people that used this trail to hunt, which was big in that area. Or that animals used it. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car rather close to the site, so we had our eyes on it at all times. The first night, nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a little bit, and called it an evening. The next day we decided to explore the woods a little bit, but Brandon and Kaylee decided to stay behind to watch the site and spend more time together. We decided to go down the path that we had found. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity. And no, not some voodoo or cult shit or anything like that, like flowers and notes that people left behind. And beyond the cemetery, we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer and then head back because it was getting late. That night we really partied hard because we were about to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer or weed. Now this night was the polar opposite of the other night. The other night was peaceful and we assumed the same about this night as we began to turn in. But boy, were we wrong. You would assume that there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on the path or foot tracks around our site, but no, not at all. All of us woke to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. As we hear the fabric being ripped by what we assumed to be something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both himself and Sarah to his car. Now here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car while the other 2 tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone because before getting into his car, he yelled cemetery and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side. So I quickly grab Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and start running toward the trail. I use my phone flashlight to help see. You might think, why would you turn your flashlight on? Well, last thing I wanted to do was miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. By the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had noped the fuck out of there and we could hear the guy chasing us, but from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily, and I hop over the fence first. When we all get over the fence, we notice that Steve had not arrived yet, so we all hid. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking as if someone were climbing over the fence behind us. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled cemetery. We all stayed as still as we possibly could as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight moments, you're capable of a lot more than you would think, and your brain is put on some super high alert mode. As the guy approached, I realized I had my small Swiss Army pocket knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer, when he was right on top of me, I grabbed the knife and lodged it into the back of his knee. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. Soon the pair of headlights came around the corner. Steve had made it. We all got up and ran toward the car. As I stood, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had a look of pure hatred in his eyes as he clutched the back of his knee. By his side laid a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and even before I fully closed the door, Steve had floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove to the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel or something. It was a friendly old couple. They told us there wasn't one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought us his hunting rifle with which to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there, there was nothing stolen, but all of our tents were slashed apart. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back, the officers were at their home, and we gave our statements. They said there wasn't enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way back. We were all processing what had just happened. The police unfortunately never found the guy. College split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group, and it's been a year. My advice to all of you is please find a populated place to camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, please. I live in Oklahoma, and I'm really big into finding abandoned places and exploring them. I found out a few months ago that there is a forgotten graveyard a few minutes away from my house. I've lived in Oklahoma my whole life, and I've never even heard anyone mention this place before. So I looked it up and did more research on it to make sure that I wasn't walking into something crazy or where I could possibly be harmed. I found out that it was the site of an old schoolhouse, and that there was no marker, so people had basically just forgotten that it was even there over the years unless they had a loved one that was buried there. I waited until daylight to go just in case, because I wanted to be able to see everything around me since I was in the middle of nowhere. I ended up asking my sister if she wanted to go with me so that I wouldn't be alone. And God, am I glad that I asked her to come, because I never thought I would have saw what I did. We woke early the next morning to go before it got hot because it was summertime. It was 10 minutes away from the house, so it was an easy drive. Finding the exact location was the hard part. Once we did find it, we pulled up and got out and started to look around. The grass was all overgrown, and you couldn't really see any of the headstones anymore. We had to be super careful walking around because we didn't want to step on anyone. We explored for about an hour or so, and then we stumbled upon this opening where the old schoolhouse used to be. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it sounded like someone or something was running right at us, but there was no one else around. And mind you, again, we're in the middle of nowhere. So we stop what we're doing and back up a bit to look and see. Neither of us spook easy, so we just looked around and we didn't see anything. We decided it was getting too hot to just stand out there for much longer, and so we started walking back to the car. Again, it sounded like something or someone was running at us, but faster this time. We both took off sprinting to the car and didn't stop until we got in and locked the doors. As we sat there, I looked up more about this place, and it's known by a few people to have major activity, and it's so bad that they actually tell you not to go at nighttime. I read stories of people who said they had seen figures walking around, or someone asking them for help and then disappearing a few minutes later. I'm glad that I decided to wait until daylight, and that I asked my sister to come with me, because I don't know what I would have done if I heard someone that I couldn't even see running at me if I were alone. I've never been back to this graveyard. It actually kinda scares me to even think about going back after what happened, when, though it wasn't anything serious like some of the other stuff people had said happened to them, maybe one day I'll have the guts to return. Honestly, I don't think I've ever experienced paranormal activity in terms of seeing something. But ever since I was a kid in my childhood home, I was really scared, almost traumatized of seeing something or hearing something in the dark at night. No specific reason for it. I would just stare at the door frame of my room, which was always opened at night, and wait for something to show. I never even liked horror movies, and even now at 21 I avoid them because I know they freak me out, so I don't believe that the fear came from the movies. The thing is, I moved to a different city when I was 18 years old and changed a few apartments until now, and in every single one of them, I felt chills. Everything is fine, and then comes a certain time of night when it's like the energy in the room changes, and I have a feeling that someone is watching me. I always believed that if I could convince myself not to believe in spirits, or that the paranormal is real, then I can escape from that, and nothing weird will happen to me if I don't believe or give it attention. Am I right? But here we are. I started to think, what if the cold, watching feeling and fear I get every night is related to some childhood trauma that I might not remember? Fast forward to today. My boyfriend and I moved back to his parents' house after the lockdown. We have a separate upper apartment for ourselves, and no one but him ever lived there. We have spent so many months and nights here before, and really the apartment never gave me any chills. Until the last month or so. So lately I have this really bad vibe in this place, especially at night. It can be dark outside around 6 p.m. or 10 p.m. and everything is super. Then there just comes this time, after midnight, when the air in the room changes and I feel like something negative has entered. The whole energy is negative, and the feeling of someone looking at me returns. Most of the time I'm scared to have my eyes opened, that I might see something. He doesn't feel the same thing and says it's because of the stress and anxiety. And true, it might just be paranoia, and I'm going crazy. But I had several nights when I really did feel like something was messing with me. I would wake up with the sensation like someone had pushed me, and my boyfriend was dead asleep. I would have sleep paralysis and again would have a feeling like someone is poking me and hear banging noises that weren't there. I was sleepless for a few nights, and then I started taking Xanax just to make me fall into deep sleep to get some rest. When I am able to sleep, there's that time before falling into sleep when I feel the most vulnerable because of the dark and the dead silence. There are radiator noises and downstairs noises, which, by the way, are loud footsteps even in the middle of the night. And sometimes I would ask them if they were awake at the time, and they said they were sleeping. But still, I kind of comfort myself with the idea of it just being normal house noises. The worst thing is going to the bathroom at night. I have bladder issues, so it's normal for me to go at 1, 2 a.m. Don't know why, but I noticed this pattern. And often, I'm just terrified. I use my phone as a flashlight and practically run there. If I can hold it, I do, because that's how scared I am of the negative energy in the air. I'm so afraid of seeing a shadow or a face staring at me. It's like I know that something is present, but I'm unable to give it shape or form. Sometimes it's like I can sense someone's breath on my face. Never thought I would write something like this because it is the opposite of ignoring the problem and convincing myself that I am imagining. But I'm not sure what to do anymore. Every night I lay in my bed, and in just moments, the air in the room switches to negative, cold, and spooky. I can't live like this. It's stressing me out so much, and I just want to know if it makes any sense. Am I crazy and too paranoid so that I just imagine all of this? Or could it really be that something is there? Believe it or not, my story is true. My name is Brandy, I am 56, and I live in Washington. All these years, my kids wanted me to write down events that happened to myself and my loved ones. Quite a few members of my family have recently passed away, leaving so many untold stories that I didn't want these experiences to die with me. So for my children, here it goes. A lot of messed up and supernatural things have happened to us in our lifetime, most with witnesses. This is one of them. About 27 years ago, while house hunting for a rental, I met the former renter of this run-down but livable house. She warned me not to live in this house because I have small children. And not only was it run down, it was very haunted, and never, she was stern, never let a man live here with you because he will be taken over by the evil that resides within. Now, I'm thinking she's either crazy or she was just mad at the landlord for something. We needed a home incredibly desperately. I was also thinking that I had lived through worse, and houses could always be cleansed, so I blew it off. I ended up renting the house, but I soon realized that I should have heeded her warning. The house was musty and old, made of wood. The walls, the ceilings, and the floors were all wood. Even the bedroom doors blended in with the walls, but the bedrooms were painted on the other side. There were French doors all along the front of the house going into an enclosed but open-viewed screen porch with a front door. The main living space was long and open. The living and dining area were stretched into one long room, and it was always cold despite having the heater on and it being in the desert. It was located in the high desert of California on the corner of an acre lot of barren desert, and across the street there was a popular grocery store and a few small shops too far away for anyone to hear us. It served as a town hall back in the day, and I think a turkey ranch before that. It was 6 a.m., and we had planned a 3-day trip to the happiest place in the world, Disneyland. My kids, Michael, age 1, Penny, age 4, and Jenny, age 3, were all sleeping on my bed in our bedroom at the other end of the house so I could pack in peace for the trip in the dining room and not wake them. I could see the bedroom door, though, and it was closed. I was standing up folding clothes at the table. My boyfriend's mother, Opal, was sitting across from me when we heard the bedroom door creak open slightly. We both looked up, and it was my daughter Jenny in her little pink and white flowered onesie. I said, "Now you know it's too early. Go back to bed." And she replied, "Me up now, Mommy," in her little sweet voice. It made us both chuckle, and I told Opal that I thought she was just excited. I told her no, that we weren't going right now, so please go back to bed. She stomped her foot, which we could feel vibrate through the floorboards. Opal then told me that I had better go and put her back, and I agreed. As I was making that long walk toward her, I was keeping eye contact, and as I was walking, I was telling her, "No, baby," and once again she stomps her foot, smiles, and says louder, "Me up," with the sweetest little smile, and she tilted her head. Opal even muttered, "Aw." It didn't dawn on me at the time how perfect that her little pigtails were. At this point, I'm extending my hands toward her. I get about 6 inches from touching her, and all of a sudden she turned black and disappeared almost like sand falling to the ground, followed by the door quickly closing behind her. Opal said, "What the hell?" in surprise. Shocked, I stood there with my hands still extended, and then the fear ran through my body like hot and cold needles. My kids were all sleeping behind that door. I grabbed the handle and swung open the door, fearing the worst, only to find my little Jenny fast asleep with her sister's leg over her. Whatever we had seen, it couldn't have been her. Although unsettling, Opal and I didn't talk about what had happened, and later that morning we all piled into the car and went on our trip. We had a great time, but when we came home we were met with all of the lights on and old music playing loudly coming from inside. People were standing around in my living room. 2 separate groups, like 2 different periods of time. I turned to my boyfriend and asked how those people got in and if he left the door unlocked. He told me, "No, why the hell would I do that? You saw me lock it." We all got out of the car and cautiously approached the front door. As I got closer, I could see a couch not where our couch was, with a man in a white tank top sitting there. He was dirty, and he was looking at this boy standing in the corner with such hatred, you could tell the boy was abused by the way that he was standing there with his head down. That's when he looked up at me, and it pierces my soul even now just to think about him. The kids were scared, and the dog was growling. I grabbed the doorknob to put my key in. Just then the music stopped, and the lights went out. We opened the door, and nothing had been moved, and no one was there. I couldn't get the image of that sad-looking little boy out of my mind, and it was a while before I saw him again. It was a nice day. My boyfriend and his mother were still at a doctor's appointment, and the kids and I were out grocery shopping, having a good time. I usually kept the living room light on when I knew that we were going to get home after dark. I didn't realize we would be gone that long, and it was just starting to be dusk. I pulled into the gate, and I think the kids were a little too rambunctious, too much spare change, quarter machine candy, I guess. I sat for a moment, planning my attack with getting all these groceries, a sleeping baby, and the 2 girls up the steps and into the house, when I noticed movement in the living room. No one was home. I could hardly even see anything in there because the light wasn't on. I started to get out when the girls jumped out of the car and started running for the steps. I yelled for them to stop and ran over to them. We could hear noises like a child running around, and my eldest daughter to this day says that she saw a little boy and describes him to a T, but at that moment I thought that it might be an intruder or something like that. 3 steps went up to a landing, a locked front door opening into a windowed screened-in porch, and then the 3 French doors. I told the kids to go to the car, but they were too scared to leave my side. Both of them were clutching the back of my shirt. I armed myself with a huge stick by the landing and forged on. I burst through the front door to the porch, and he was there, his face in his 2 hands cupped against the glass, as if he was peering out, and then he vanished. It was the boy that I had seen standing in the corner before. We went inside and I searched every room with my obviously frightened children practically glued to my side. There was no one there. Was my mind playing tricks on me, and I was projecting my fear onto the girls? I turned on all the lights and ran out to get my sleeping baby and the rest of the groceries out of the car when I stopped in my tracks. There on the glass were 2 crescent moon handprints, and it was fogged up where his nose was. It stayed there for at least 20 minutes. Just to add my own thoughts here, I don't feel that we always need words to communicate with spirits or for them to get a message to us. They are not bound by flesh. It is important that you have an open mind and always keep your will strong. At night, you could look out the French doors at the stores across the street and see the vast desert behind them. The property was pitch black, so you saw the reflection of yourself and whatever was behind you. That night, everyone was asleep. It was nearly Christmas, so I was admiring the lights decorating the storefronts when I felt one of my children through the floorboards skip up next to me, and then I heard a faint giggle. I felt a tug on my shirt, so I turned my gaze to the reflection, extending my arm over as if to caress the back of his head and pull him in next to me. It didn't occur to me that this was not my child. He came in under my arm and stood there looking up at me, and all I could feel was love and sorrow. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. So I looked back at his reflection, and it was gone as well. He was about 7 or 8 years old. He had what looked like black and white Converse on, and was wearing old jeans with rolled-up cuffs. I could see the edge of a white t-shirt under a light gray sweatshirt, and his hair was sandy blonde and wisped to the side with the sweetest smile. In that moment, I felt everything that he was feeling, and I cried. I saw the images of abuse flash through my head. I don't want to elaborate on that, and he made me feel that the man was not his father, and that he loved the comfort of our presence. There were so many emotions. I went to bed and held my kids tight. I was so full of questions, like what happened to his mom? How did he die? I looked for records and was told that back in the day there were not many records kept out there in the desert. A person could live and die, and no one would know unless it was specifically reported. I felt whatever else was in the house was evil, and we found out just how evil it was the longer that we lived there. I feel I should describe the bedroom so that you can get a feel of the surroundings. On one side of the room there was my full-size bed against the wall, and a single bed next to me against the other wall, separated by a small nightstand with a lamp where my 2 little girls slept. The door to the living room was next to their bed, and at our feet was the hall door and closet. Many nights, we would see the light beneath the door get blocked out, as if someone were walking up to my room just standing there, and then they would fade away. At first we thought it was just Opal going to the bathroom, since it was right next to our room, but we found out later that it wasn't her, because she was frail and had to use a potty chair in her room. The dog would sometimes growl and scratch, but when we opened the door to the hall, no one was ever there. Almost every morning at 6 a.m., we could hear the lid to the toilet slam up and the toilet flush, but when we ran in there, the lid was down and the water was still. A phone would start ringing in my room despite us not even having one, and we would hear old music coming from the walls from time to time. At first, we thought that it was coming from the pipes of our neighbor or something like that, but we didn't have any neighbors because the lady had already moved out, and that house was completely empty. So many things happened there, but this night in particular caused me to never let my girls sleep in their own bed alone. The girls were so happy that day. They had both received a package from my mom full of princess stuff. Toys, cups, and bowls, 2 beach towels, and 2 nightgowns embossed with their favorite princess images. The nightgowns were short and silky, and after their bath they begged to wear them to bed, so I happily complied. It was quiet in the house that night. Opal was with family along with my boyfriend, and I don't remember where the dog was, but he wasn't present anyway. I tucked them in, oldest by the wall and youngest closest to me on the outside. I wasn't ready for sleep, so I put a scarf over the lamp to dim the light, so that I could still read. Now I was sitting on my bed next to them, and as I was reading, the covers slightly came down off of the girls. I didn't really think anything of it because my oldest daughter was notorious for kicking off the blankets, so I tucked them both in and continued reading. It happened again, and once again I covered them back up. At this point I was starting to feel uneasy and the hairs on my arms were beginning to raise. Never a good sign. I looked at my oldest daughter and noticed that she hadn't moved. So how was this happening? I sat back down on my bed and pretended to read while intently staring at the covers over the book pages, feeling my heart pound through my chest. Moments passed, and I felt myself trembling, trying to hold the book steady, and then it happened. I saw the covers start to move, but the girls were still. I was confused. I didn't understand what was going on. The covers were then pulled down with force, so I leapt up and grabbed the covers from the end of the bed, pulling them up. At this point I was standing next to them and my voice quivered as I yelled at whatever was in the room to stay away from my girls. I still don't know who I was yelling at. I sat on the bed next to them, gripping the covers tight, when they were jerked from my hands down to the foot of the bed, exposing my girls' legs. My youngest daughter's nightgown started to rise up to the top of her thigh. She started to scream and grabbed at her leg as if she were feeling pain, waking her sister. I threw my body over both girls and screamed at whatever it was to get out and leave us alone repeatedly. I tried my best to calm the girls down and protect them. We stayed huddled together all night. This was the last time they slept alone in that house. I was able to get a bigger bed, and we all slept together from that point forward. At this point, I'm sure you're wondering, why didn't we just leave? Believe me, I wanted to, but I felt trapped. Not just by the house, but also by my boyfriend. Let me start by saying that Bill was not the nicest man. Oh yeah, from the outside he was great. He had a charming voice, and he made people laugh. Nobody thought that he was capable of doing the things that he did. They didn't know him like I did. I feel he tricked me when we first got together. I was young and impressionable. He knew I had low self-esteem, so he made me feel like I wasn't good enough for anyone else and was lucky to have him. We had children together. I knew what he was capable of, and let's just say that I didn't want to lose anyone I loved, so that's why I didn't leave him. But this was different. This was not him. This was an entirely new level of evil. I started noticing a shift in him the longer that we lived in that house. We stopped going out as a family, and he stopped working. He put bars on the windows, and one-way locks on all the doors with only one key. Not even his mother cared. She would go into her bedroom and shut the door so that she didn't have to hear me scream, or our children cry when he sometimes hit me. And like always, he made me feel like it was my fault. Living there changed him, though. The things he started to do were out of his character, and that made me more uncomfortable. He started watching me from dark rooms and behind cracks in the doors. When I asked him why he was doing this, he got mad and made me feel like I was crazy. When we were alone together in that house, it was even more intense. One such night the kids were at my mother's, and we had just finished dinner. We were sitting together on the couch watching TV, and I was mending a sock. It had been a pretty good day. I noticed a change in the atmosphere, and for some reason he seemed to have gotten quiet. I was just about to ask him if he wanted me to change the channel when a small flash of light hit my right eye. It wasn't until shortly after trying to find the source that I realized he was staring at me the whole time through a little piece of broken mirror in his right hand, hidden by the throw cover. My God, those eyes weren't his. I know him. This was not my person sitting next to me, and I was frightened to the core. He didn't even realize that I saw this, so I sprung up. His mom just had a phone installed, so I'm trying to call my mother and check on the kids. He jumped and hid the mirror in the couch cushions and started trying to reason with me as to why I should come back and sit down next to him and not make that phone call. I noticed that while he was talking, he wasn't even looking at me. He was looking behind my head, almost as if he were looking through me. I glanced at my reflection in the glass door, but nothing was behind me. I grabbed the phone and called my mother, assuring him that I was only going to be a minute. We stayed on the phone until he fell asleep, and quite a bit longer. My mother knew what was going on, but she felt helpless, as I did at that time. He got up, grumbling something as he walked into the bedroom to go to sleep on the bed, so after we hung up, I stayed awake with the blanket on the couch covering everything but my eyes while listening to him breathe until dawn, when I finally fell asleep. There was another time at around 4 p.m. We needed some groceries for dinner, so I got the girls ready and left my baby boy asleep in his playpen in the living room. Opal was napping at the dining room table, and my Bill was sitting on the edge of our bed in the bedroom. I called out to him that I was leaving, and to keep an ear out for the baby, but he didn't respond, so I repeated myself and I heard him mutter, "Yeah, sure." So we left. The store didn't have something his mother wanted, so I had to go to 2 stores. It had just gotten dark as we pulled up, and I could hear the baby crying. I rushed in, and Bill's mother was still sitting at the table. I picked up my son, and he was soaking wet, and it looked like he had been crying for a while. I was changing his diaper, trying to calm him down, and the whole time Opal was getting mad at me for leaving her alone with the baby. I was furious, and I told her, "I didn't. I left him with your son." She looked surprised. She didn't even know that he was home. What the hell? Where was he? I put my son down and told the girls to go play. Something wasn't right. I didn't think he was still in the bedroom because the lights were off, but someone was in there. It was abnormally dark. I slowly went up to the door and walked in. There was a dim light coming in through a crack in the blinds, and I saw his silhouette still sitting on the bed. He hadn't moved. His feet were on the floor, and he was slightly hunched forward with his elbows resting on his legs, cupping his hands together. The room smelled stuffy, and the air was thick. I called out his name, but he didn't reply. Once again I called out his name, adding, "You're scaring me." I moved closer, saying, "Why are you not answering me?" I saw that he was sweating and that it was glistening in the light and dripping from his head to his hands and then his hands to the floor. I could hear it as it dripped. I was shaking while I slowly made my way around him to the lamp, and I heard a growl that almost sounded like it was coming up from the floorboards. I turned the lamp on. His shirt was soaking wet. There was a pool of sweat at his feet, and his eyes were darker than I've ever seen them. His stare was fixated downward. I was afraid to get near him, but I felt like he needed my help. I started to shake him while calling out his name. He was cold to the touch. I crouched down in front of him between his legs, but honestly, all I wanted to do was run out of that room. I took his face in my shaking hands and said, "Please, Bill." Just like that, he snapped out of it. He grabbed both of my wrists and hurled me onto the bed behind him. He said in a loud voice, "What are you doing, you freak?" Then he got up and went to the bathroom. I heard him turn on the shower as I laid there curled up, not knowing what had just happened. I soon composed myself and went out to bring in the groceries and make dinner. Later he joined us as if nothing had ever happened, but I still felt uneasy. The night went on, and he was his old self, goofing off with the kids and watching cartoons. I went into the kitchen and started washing dishes with my back to the hall. I heard him in the living room with the kids. I swear, I heard him. The next thing I knew, he was behind me, and he aggressively grabbed my waist and put his mouth on me. I could feel his teeth on my neck. I jumped. He startled me. Then he looked at me like he wanted me dead and said, "You disgust me," and left the house. I don't know where he went. I didn't ask. All I know is that he was gone. He came back later that next morning, dirty, and saying something about him getting lost in the desert. I remember him telling me once that I could scream out there and no one would hear me. We eventually got out of that house after living through horror, not knowing from day to day what was going to happen next, and who was safe from that evil. Later, after his mother had moved into her daughter's house, she passed away. I felt bad because I wasn't even sad about it. I found a way to leave Bill. I made an excuse that I needed to pick up a check from the welfare department and that I had to bring the kids with me. After I got there, I told them that I was being abused, and they helped me find a safe place to go. After I didn't return that day, a detective from the sheriff's department came and asked me questions about him because apparently he stole a child and took her to that empty house. Thank God he was caught before he could do anything to her. I never let him hurt my children, but sadly, they remember him hurting me. For years after that, I would have nightmares of him appearing at the foot of my bed, clawing his way up my legs, and closing the space between our faces with his cold breath on my lips and those eyes. I would wake up gasping for air. About 9 years ago, I looked up his name and found him on a website exposing predators. I still shiver when I see small mirrors or broken glass. A few years after we moved out, I ran into the former renter, so I asked her if she knew anything about a little boy ever living there, or did someone die there, and she said, now this is not fact. She said that she heard, I don't know where though, that there was a boy and his mother disappeared, leaving him with his stepdad, who is horribly abusive. Later, the boy was found stuffed in a hole on the property, dead, and they found the stepfather's dried and decayed body on the couch in the living room. He had committed suicide. Like I said, I don't know if that's true, but it seemed pretty damn close to how I felt. I wish even now that I could have helped that sweet little boy move on. We couldn't even drive down that street for years after that, and we all cried with relief many years later when we found out that the house had been demolished to the ground and that a housing tract was being built over the land. I still wonder if those people living there are plagued by the same evil that plagued us. During the past few years, my gifts of clairvoyancy have developed further, which has created some moments where I truly have questioned my sanity. Former teachers of mine have communicated to me from beyond their grave. 2 of them have led me to where they are buried, and I have predicted 3 district deaths. The first teacher to come through was actually a nurse from the local school, followed by my 6th grade social studies teacher. I was aware that the nurse had passed away in 2012, so I wasn't surprised when she came through. However, I was unaware of the second one passing, and immediately went into denial mode. Eventually, through clues via dreams and meditation, I was able to locate her final resting place. I went from being in denial to being absolutely speechless. I followed the clues that she gave me, and there I was, at her grave. It was at that moment that I realized that what I was dealing with was reality and that I was not losing my mind. The creepy thing is the numbers of her plot are the same as the numbers in the school district where she taught. As I was visiting her on March 1st, 2017, I had a flash or image prediction about another former teacher passing away, and they would be buried in the same cemetery. On March 6th, another one of my 6th grade teachers passed away, and a few days later they were buried in the same cemetery. The process repeated itself, and he led me to where he is buried. That isn't the only death or dreams, visions that I've had. I've had 2 others. One was in December of 2016, hours after the teacher passed away, and one was in June 2017, 6 months prior to her passing. There seems to be no time structure when it comes to dreams or visions, and the time of passing itself. It ranges in hours after to 6 months before. A couple of months ago, I had another dream, and while nothing has happened as of yet, I am very concerned. The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a, later confirmed, murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was at the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was around twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend, who has 20/20 vision, saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up. At first, we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking that this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. He didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no gear at night and no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes, absent, blank, off. He didn't answer my boyfriend, just kept walking right toward him. Red flags were going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had concealed a knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He muttered something like, "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we're miles away from a single soul. And it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear once again, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any response, but instead asked him what was going on. Again, he didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were actually at our site, so he actually asked how many people were there, and began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and again my boyfriend didn't answer him. He carried on circling around. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in a direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with no camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in this direction, completely off the path. He kept going for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He just went still. Totally silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him, and by this time it was dark. I started freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a pussy in front of my boyfriend. We had to talk about whether or not we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said that if anything were to happen to him, I should run. When he said that, I knew that it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said we needed to get out of there, and to just grab essential items. I was terrified that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This was the type of guy who'd probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk/run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience has stayed with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was there that night. I've tried. Now again, this was at the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type into Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. There were. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman that was with him ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of those details were the same ones as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time, twilight, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realized this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him. Not just us. Apparently, this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us. I'm going to start this out by giving some background on my mother. She's currently 58, a nurse, and a devoted Christian. Other than the occasional drink, she doesn't do anything to alter her mind. This story begins one day when my mom laid down for a nap. The way she described it, she wasn't asleep, but she began to see a video of sorts repeating in her head as soon as she closed her eyes. She saw a young teenage girl dressed in a schoolgirl outfit, floating away in a boat and waving. My mom could feel her emotions, her sadness and worry for her grandmother as she said goodbye. She could feel that this girl was going to a peaceful place. As well as this, she saw a calendar turn 3 times. This vision repeated itself once or twice, until my mother came to. She thought it was a vision of our family friend Shannon, but it didn't look quite like her. Later on, during the month of March, there was a shooting at a local rave. Shannon's younger sister was shot and killed. She was wearing the exact schoolgirl outfit that my mother saw her in during the vision. The fact that it happened in March means that the calendar was a warning of what was to come. We are unsure of why exactly my mom was meant to see this, but we were able to provide some comfort to the family by letting them know that she was somewhere safe and peaceful. I work in a pharmacy that's located inside a nursing home, and I've been working there for the past 4 years. Just a note to mention, I've had many prior paranormal experiences in my life, but this is still ongoing. I've always felt a presence since the first week that I started, but it was never anything that made me feel threatened. Things didn't really start happening until last year, when I was talking to my coworkers about feeling a presence, and asking if that was something that they had experienced as well. The day after I had a conversation with my coworker, I was working a night shift. On our night shifts, there's only one technician and a pharmacist. I was sitting at the back counter on my computer when I thought that I had seen someone come through the door. We're usually not busy at night, but there is the odd time when one of the nurses will come down for a bag of chips or a pop. I got up from where I was seated and walked over to where our cash register was, and from there you can see the pop coolers and the chip racks. I couldn't see anyone, so I left and walked back and forth, looking down the aisles. Nobody was there. I asked my coworker if he had seen anyone come in, and he said no, but I was 99.9% sure that someone had walked through that door. I didn't think much of it. It was late, and I decided that I was probably just tired. I sat back down in my chair and started filling prescriptions. About 25 minutes later, I looked up and saw a pack of toilet paper slowly moving forward to the edge of the shelf before it dropped on the ground, startling me. There's absolutely no way that it could have just been our air system or a draft that had knocked it off. My coworker saw this too, and also thought it was odd. I told him it was a spirit that moved it, and he looked at me like I had 5 heads. So, to prove my point, I brought up the security camera footage. On the video, you can see 2 bright and fairly large orbs moving around as the toilet paper was being moved. I showed it to him, and there was no denying that it was a spirit trying to make itself known. That was my first significant paranormal experience at the pharmacy. We've had things go missing only to find them in the strangest places. For example, my car keys went missing one day from my locker, only for me to find them in with the prescription vials. My coworkers all swore up and down that nobody had hidden them there, and I most definitely didn't. Things are always falling off of the shelves, and sometimes they're heavy items, not just something light like the toilet paper incident. We had a 5-kilogram jug of Epsom salts crash onto the ground and break open, and no one was even remotely close to the aisle. Many of my coworkers and I see what looks like someone walking by out of the corner of our eye, only to realize that no customers are in the store. We also hear what sounds like the door to the front entrance open and close, and nobody is coming in. This happens multiple times a day, sometimes. The only time I've ever felt threatened or scared so far was when I was working the night shift and got locked in the bathroom. It could well have been a hardware malfunction, but I don't believe that it was. The handle locked from the inside, and I don't normally lock it anyways. I did my business, flushed the toilet, and washed my hands. I went to exit the seemingly unlocked door and felt that it was being held shut from the other side. I figured it was just my coworker messing with me, so I started yelling his name, and that it wasn't very funny, and to let me out. The handle started moving as if someone was on the other side, wiggling it. I yelled again for my coworker, and he must have finally heard me because I could hear his footsteps. He asked what was wrong, and then pulled the door open with ease. He's now finally starting to believe that I wasn't crazy, and that this place actually has some paranormal activity going on. I used to work as a cleaner when I was 16 and between colleges. This is the UK, so I had already left school. The place where I worked was a popular clothing store near my house and was built over ancient farmland. There were also rumors of druid burial grounds nearby, but that's another story. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal from a very young age, but this was by far the most haunted place I've ever worked, and my first apparition sighting. We were a team of 4 to 5 people, and all of us were assigned to different parts of the store. One of the sections was the women's fitting rooms. We would vacuum the rugs and cubicles, polish the mirrors, and all of that. You would hear high heels on the tiles the whole time that you were down there, and the sounds of rustling paper, coat hangers rattling, that kind of thing. There was also a general feeling of discomfort and unease, as though you were being followed and watched. This is hours before the store opened, so of course there were no customers. Sometimes a manager would be there, but they stayed upstairs in the office. The next part was the men's clothing area, which was on the second floor. When you cleaned there, you were alone but for the occasional manager walking through. One time I was on the floor cleaning the railings by the cash registers, and a huge, black shadow swept over me. I was surprised because I hadn't heard anybody approach, and as I looked around, I was definitely alone. My cleaning routine was to sweep the floor and collect the dirt into little piles around the pillars, then sweep it up all in one go at the end. The dirt piles moved constantly. I would go back to do the final big sweep, and some of the piles always would have disappeared. After I clocked out, the piles would be there again. I had a sense that the spirit was a young male farmhand who was very mischievous. I said as much to my coworker, and she told me that she refuses to clean in that area after polishing the mirrors one day and seeing the disembodied head of a young man peering over her shoulder. Aside from my instances with the piles, I would always hear the sound of coat hangers rattling and shuffling noises, but I never felt threatened by it. I used to laugh it off or just tell the spirit to stop, and he would most of the time. Now, after the store was clean, we would clean the staff quarters. Toilets and canteen, meeting rooms. The toilets were a non-paranormal horror in themselves. Note, I worked here with my mother. We were assigned to clean the female toilets, and usually if someone was using them, we would leave and give them privacy until they finished. So we went in, the middle stall was closed, and we heard rustling paper and heavy breathing. So we left and waited. And waited. And waited. The cleaning cupboard was right next to the toilets, and didn't even have a door. We would have seen and heard anybody who might have left. To leave and enter the toilets, you would have to walk straight past the open doorway and then walk down the corridor that directly faced it. It was an L-shaped corridor, with the toilets on the far end and the cleaning cupboard on the corner. Except when we went in after waiting 10 to 15 minutes, the middle stall door was wide open and empty. Now, on to the apparition. The children's clothing area was generally less creepy. There were coat hangers moving again. Sometimes things would fall off the shelves and rails, but we always just shrugged it off. The elevator was directly opposite the children's clothing, and we usually loaded our cleaning equipment into the elevator because it was too heavy to carry up the stairs. I remember rinsing my mop out, and I glanced up. There was a little boy around 6 or 7 years old, standing directly in front of me. He wore a flat cap, a pale shirt with suspenders, dark shorts, and socks up to his knees. At first I thought it was a mannequin, and when I blinked, he was gone. I thought I was just tired, and I shook my head. I spoke to my mother about it later, as she's Wiccan and super into the supernatural, and I described the boy to her. She had seen the exact same child a few weeks before, but only the back of him, as if he had been walking around a corner. She told me that she had the feeling he had died of lung-related issues, perhaps tuberculosis or pneumonia. So there you have it. Some of it can be explained by tiredness, I know, but I just thought I would share this experience. My family has a camping timeshare, and we used to go there for weeks at a time in the summer. My dad had to work, so he would stay at home Monday through Thursday and come and meet us at the campgrounds Friday through Sunday. The campgrounds had a pool, a miniature golf course, basketball courts, and we'd gone for so long that my mom was comfortable letting us wander since there was only one entrance and exit. When I was around 8, but was fairly small for my age, so I looked around 5, I met a little boy who was camping with his single dad for a few days. He came to our campsite a lot, and knew we were staying for a while. I was pretty sad when he left, but his dad said they'd come back sometime soon. A few weeks later, his dad came back to the campsite right after my mom left to take a shower. He told me his son was coming later that week. He asked where my parents were, and I told him my dad doesn't come until Friday and that my mom always takes a shower at this time. He said bye and then left. The next day, he came by at the same time and told me that he had just found some kittens and asked if I wanted one. I said yes. He told me he kept them in his tent and that I could come pick one out. Now, this guy wasn't a stranger. My mom had met him when we picked his son up from our campsite, so I didn't get that creepy stranger vibe and was okay going with him. We walked towards his campsite, but then he told me he had actually moved them to his truck so they wouldn't get too hot, which made sense to me at the time. He pointed to his truck right outside the gates of the entrance. I started walking toward the entrance with the guy when my dad pulls up. He got the day off work so he could spend more time with us. He asks what's going on, and I say, Tommy's dad said he has kittens in his truck and I can have one. My dad gets out of the car, tells me to run back to the campsite, so I do. When my dad gets back, he tells me to never go alone with an adult anywhere, even if I know them. I asked my mom years later about the whole thing, and she told me my dad kicked the crap out of him and called the cops. One night, I was working a night shift in a refinery. I was working as a quote-unquote hole watch for my shift, which means I basically sit at an entrance and document anyone that goes in and out. Well, a guy showed up, I got his name, and he gave me the company that he worked for, so I logged him in. Everything checked out, so I'm waiting at the entrance for a few hours for the guy to come back out. Now, that's nothing unusual, because most of the people that go in will stay in there between 2 to 6 hours at a time, and every hour or two I yell up to make sure that they're okay. I would yell, and usually the guys whistle back or make a noise to let me know that everything's alright, and every time I check, I thought I heard a response. A few more guys came up to go in. I log them in, let them know that there's another guy up there doing inspections. They go in and radio back, "Hey, there's no one in here." Immediately, I had a weird feeling because I was at the only exit entrance, so there's no possible way to get out of the container without me seeing. The way the container is set up, you have to climb up a ladder to get into it from underneath using a scaffold to help. I was sitting on the scaffold far back enough to where if anybody came out, they would drop down right in front of me, and the only way off of it was to go through the gate opening that I was guarding. So I radio my foreman and explained to him what had happened. He got into contact with the company and they had no one by that name and no one scheduled to check that particular container. I was completely baffled at this point. Here I am, adamant as ever that someone went up into that container. I thought I was going crazy and I was also a little weirded out. I had a signature on the log where they sign in, and I have to sign right next to their name also, acknowledging that I know that they're going in. For about 20 minutes, I'm in full panic mode and freaking out because I don't have an explanation as to what happened, or where he went, or who he was. And on top of that, I could have easily lost my job because of it. I'm employed as a policeman, and I work the night shift in a tiny little town. The population here barely breaks 1,000. Needless to say, I know the town well enough to be able to tell when something is wrong. Near the center of the town, there's the old school they used before they built the new elementary and high schools. The building is listed as a historical site and can't be demolished, but due to asbestos, renovations would cost the town too much to be worth the work. This school sits within feet of the public library, and behind it sits the town's fairground. It isn't an official fairground, but every year they had bull riding and small shows that they would put on for kids during the summer. With all of those details out of the way, I will explain what happened. I noticed the backlight to the library on, which is not normal since it wasn't on all night, and it isn't a motion light, so I parked on the north side of the old school grounds. I walked through the fence and had to pass the school to get to the library. I would stop every few feet and listen because the gravel was so loud. When I stopped the second or third time, I thought I heard a squeal in the school, like the sound of a door. At first I didn't think anything of it, since I figured I was hearing things. The town just replaced all the windows on this building, so I thought I wouldn't be able to hear the inside. When I investigated the light and found all the doors locked, I started walking back around to my car. As I passed by the school again, I heard a noise in the building again, and I stopped and listened. And as I shined my light, I noticed a basement window was broken out. So when I walked up to the window, I looked down and in, and didn't see anything. I kept walking, and I heard the squeal again. It reminded me of those bathroom doors in schools that the hinges always squealed really loud and echoed. When I came around the corner, I saw 2 cats roughhousing in the dirt. They stopped to watch me, and then both of them turned and looked at the door. I couldn't see for myself because it was around another corner. One hissed, and they both bolted away from the school, which put me on edge. I know this school is absolutely not in use, nor are there any plans to use this school anytime soon. Also, the local kids and homeless don't come here, ever. It's a landmark the city as a whole really admires, and there hasn't ever been an issue with breaking and entering, at least not for a long time. So when I came around the corner, I saw the door and I walked up to it to see what the cats had run from. I looked for other animals, but that didn't make sense because they looked up as if someone were standing in the window of the door. Not like they would if it were a raccoon or a dog that ran off without me seeing. When I looked in the window with my light, I could see a gigantic Raggedy Ann painted on the wall, and I assumed this was the kindergarten section or something. And then I stepped back from the door getting ready to leave, and I heard whistling. It wasn't really loud, but it was loud enough to make me stop. That little voice in the back of my head was talking now and telling me I was just hearing things, but the dude that likes the dump of fear of the unknown told me to go back to the door. So I went back and listened again, and I know it was whistling, and not like the squeak of an animal or an object from inside. It got louder when I came to the door again, and it had a tune, but I don't know how to describe it. So now thinking someone is in the school, I went around and checked all the doors, including the second floor door that I had to climb the rusty metal stairs that were more like a death trap to see in through. When I couldn't find a way into the school, I checked it all over again, and when I left, I couldn't figure out what it was. The whistling had stopped, and I even hung around outside for a few minutes without my light on, just watching, figuring out if someone was in there. They would eventually need to use a light to get around or to get back out, but there was nothing after 20 or so minutes. So I got in my car, circled the block, and parked down the way with my lights off to watch for someone to come out at some point. But no one did, and there haven't been any lights on. I know this story seems kind of boring compared to the others, but working nights gets you on edge. And for all the things I know I experienced before, this was in my top 5 bone-chilling moments while on the job. For some context, I live in an apartment with 3 other people while we go to college, but it's currently just me until January since the others went back home. I was singing a song that got stuck in my head when I heard whistling from the kitchen at the same time to the same tune. I thought one of the other roommates may have come back early, so I shouted out to them, but didn't get a response. I went to the kitchen, which is only just a few feet from the bathroom, and no one was there or anywhere else in the apartment. I checked the hallway outside, but didn't see anyone or hear a door open and shut in the few seconds that it took for me to get to the door. The whistling was very airy, as if it was someone who couldn't whistle very well. This isn't the first thing that happened to me in the last few weeks, but it's definitely the weirdest. It could just be my imagination, but it sounded like someone was directly outside the bathroom door, whistling toward it. The other thing that happened was far less weird, and could have just been me not paying attention, but I came back from work to find that the lights in my roommate's room were on, and the fan was blowing out at the door. Even though no one had been home, and the other roommates' families live quite a long ways from here. I asked where they were, and all of them sent back replies, showing that they were nowhere near the apartment. My mom and I were camping in our kind of local national park in the Alps. I had a headache, and had slept rough that night, but nothing special other than that. My mom, who I thought had slept well, apparently really did not. The next morning she told me about dreams that she had, and that they were incredibly realistic, that they had kind of scared her. She thought she had heard men talking outside of our tent in a foreign language, and thought that we were about to be in trouble, being that we were two women alone in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw a woman walk slowly just next to our tent while looking at us. She was wearing this sort of farm outfit. Next, she saw a whole lot of people dressed in white, in trenches, just there. I will add that this national park is also the site of a World War battleground. Sometime after, she was just looking at where we were on Google Maps and saw that there was a single flashing dot on the exact spot where we had slept. Then, looking for it again, it was gone. I didn't feel or see anything particular that night, and never would have thought that my mom was having such bad dreams. We thought that what I had was sleep paralysis, with the visual hallucinations and all. But now that we talked about it again, this feels more like an encounter than a simple sleep paralysis episode. We're both okay. We're just wondering at the weirdness of it all. My late mother told me her ghost stories from a time when she worked as a charge nurse at a well-known hospital in my state. Please forgive me if the story is hard to follow, as she told me this when I was a kid. In the early 90s, my mother was fresh out of medical school and was fortunate enough to find a job at a prestigious hospital. The only downside of taking this job was the fact that she would be working the graveyard shift. A typical hospital night shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. A couple of months into the job, she found out that one of her good friends from medical school had gotten a job at the same hospital as her. Unfortunately for my mother, her friend had gotten a day shift. On this particular day, my mother's friend ran into some car trouble and couldn't get a ride home. My mom, being the helpful person that she was, told her friend that she could pick her up and take her home before her shift started. My mom picked her friend up and took her home. Her friend was thankful for my mother and insisted that she stay and eat some dinner. My mother couldn't turn down the offer as she had rushed out of the house to go and pick up her friend in the first place. My mom and her friend sat at the dining room table eating dinner. In front of the table in the family room was a large fish tank. Looking at the tank, my mother noticed that all of the fish were pressed up against one side of it. She wasn't really bothered by this, but asked her friend, "Did you forget to feed your fish today?" "Why?" "All your fish are out and pressed against one side of the tank." My mother's friend looked at the tank and laughed. Maybe it's my uncle. The fish would do that when he would look through one end of the glass. I thought you mentioned to me that your uncle had passed away when you were in medical school? Yeah, sometimes I think he's just standing there looking at the fish, or maybe I'm losing it. They both laughed it off and finished dinner. My mother thanked her friend for dinner and left to make it to work on time. My mother was less than a mile away from work when she saw blue lights in her rearview mirror. She thought to herself, was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Did I accidentally run a stop sign? All of this ran through her mind as she pulled over. The police officer came out to the car and up to the driver's side window. He shined the flashlight in my mother's eyes and asked for her license and registration. And then, the usual, do you know why I pulled you over tonight? No, sir. Well, the person in the passenger seat is jumping around and clearly isn't wearing a seatbelt. How can that be? My mom confusingly looked over to the passenger seat, and of course, the seat was empty. The officer shined his flashlight into the car and froze. My mom turned to look at the officer, who was visibly shaken and pale. After a few seconds, the officer began to mutter, No, not today, and slowly paced back to his car. In a flash, the officer took off. Must be Uncle, she thought. My mom arrived at work and started with her normal routine. The night shift didn't faze her until around 12 a.m. While finishing some patient paperwork, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted someone walking around in a patient gown. Concerned, she nudged one of her coworkers to check on the patient who was wandering around in the hall. He got up, looked down the hall, and immediately turned around back towards my mother. There was no one there. Confused, she looked over the desk, and indeed, there was no one there except other nurses and doctors. At around 2 a.m., my mom had gotten tired and decided it was time to get some coffee. She got up from her desk and began walking to the break room. On her way to the break room, she spotted the same patient wandering around the hall. Not wanting to disturb the other patients and nurses, she decided to follow this patient. She followed them until they turned and walked into one of the rooms. She walked up to the room and looked in, expecting to find them. Instead, she walked into an empty cardiology room. My mother walked out and began to think that she was losing her mind. Before exiting the room, she looked at the room number and saw that it read 616. She wrote it down on a notepad and continued with her shift. When her shift ended, she began to put away her work in her locker and pulled out her notepad. She looked at it, and it read Cardiology 616. Remembering what had happened, she used the break room phone and called her friend. Half asleep, her friend answered. My mom began to explain what had happened to her and mentioned her experience with the police officer and her shift at the hospital. Finally, my mom asked, "How did your uncle pass away, if you don't mind me asking?" "Oh, he was having some heart problems and passed away from a stroke." "When you visited him in the hospital, can you recall what room he was in?" I think it was room 616. "I think it was your uncle I saw last night and this morning." "No kidding." My mom always told me that story, and she truly believed that she had seen her friend's uncle's ghost. Though the ghost said nothing to my mother, she could only ponder the reason why. About 2 years ago, I was going shopping for a Valentine's Day gift for my girlfriend. It's about a 5 to 10 minute walk to the store from where I live. It was around 8 p.m. and I just wanted to get home. I was walking in the road because there's next to no cars going down the road, and I didn't feel like going through the park. I was approaching the park when I realized that I was being followed. I thought nothing of it at first, so I just kept walking. He then got closer and closer, and when I was walking past, I hear a, "Hey kid." I was shocked, but I wanted to ignore him, so I kept going. Then he said it again, a bit more violently. So I turned around, and this guy was within reach of me. I'm 6'1", and this man was a bit taller. He then tried to set up a conversation like, "How's your night?" I felt a bit relieved, and kinda thought poorly of myself for judging him too soon. But I was right in my assumptions. He then tried to keep a conversation going and proceeded to ask me where I was headed. I just told him that I was going to the store. He then walked up to a car and said, "I can give you a ride." I said, "No thanks, I can walk from here." He kept asking that same question, and then he said, "What about car surfing?" And then he tried to show me what it was. I still declined. This guy was really creeping me out. I was still walking down the road while this was happening. He followed me still, and thankfully I was reaching the store, so he left me alone. But not for long. I got the candy heart chocolate box and a teddy bear, and was walking back home when I saw the guy again. The weird part is that he was following me from the other side. I feel like he waited for me just to come walking by again. This was starting to scare me. He then yelled at me again, and I was terrified. I was hesitant, but I turned around. Now he was starting to jog his way over to me. Then I noticed something off. The car was gone, meaning that this guy had either walked here or he wasn't alone. I acted oblivious, like I didn't notice that the car was gone. He tried starting another conversation. I was really uncomfortable, so I just said, "I really need to get back," and I started walking faster toward the fastest route home, which is through an alley. When I was going through, he was gone, and I was thankful. But when I was walking down the alley, I don't know what it was, but I saw the same car that he was claiming as his own. When I got home, I wanted to know more about this guy. I looked online for something about him and there was nothing, of course. I wanted to know about the car. I didn't believe for a second that it was his, so I looked it up, and it was reported as stolen. I reported it just in case. I'm not sure if they ever found it, or ever found the guy in general. I just hope that I never have to deal with him again. This story took place when I was a kid. My dad has been a pool man for many years. One of his oldest customers decided to purchase a ranch. I don't exactly remember where. He asked my dad if he could come and fix their pool, which was disastrously maintained before he bought it. He gave my dad permission to bring us along, and told us that we were welcome to stay a few days to enjoy the ranch. We drove there, and I had been in charge of reading the MapQuest instructions because I never seemed to be able to sleep during car trips. We drove back home a few days later, after my dad was finally able to save the pool. The drive home was very long. For endless stretches, the view was mostly desert, farms, and the occasional small suburban town. Unlike me, my mom and brothers were knocked out almost immediately. So most of the trip, it was just my dad and I talking or listening to music. I'm also a very avid reader, so I had a book on my lap beside the maps. I remember the ride had been quiet for a while, because I had been reading. I had to stop because it was getting dark, and my dad would only let me turn on the dome lights to read the maps. No radio service, and the Game Boy batteries had all died. All I had left to do was stare out the window. All of a sudden, I spotted a very tall shadow on a roof. I realized that there was a man who seemed to be wearing a hat, bowler or top hat, dancing and jumping from rooftop to rooftop of this suburban lot. It was kind of like the scene from Singing in the Rain, which, at that point, I had not yet seen myself. It took a second for me to realize that this was not a normal thing to observe. The houses were separated in a way where a normal person couldn't possibly have jumped from roof to roof the way that thing was. What scared me the most is how at the last house before a field, he seemed to turn around and sense me. He bowed and tipped his hat. Even though I couldn't see it, I could also sense that he was smiling. All I felt was dread. I turned to my dad to see if he had also seen it, but he had of course been paying attention to the road. When I looked back, I couldn't see the houses anymore. They were way behind us. I never saw a face or any details. He was just a silhouette on the roofs. I remember the feeling of being afraid that it would follow us. That it could, if it wanted to. I never saw something like that on our many road trips ever again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, but it felt so real. The memory is so vivid as well, which always comes back when I'm watching old musicals because the dancing reminds me of the way that he moved. I am a 19-year-old female. When I was 8, right around Valentine's Day, I received one of those small manila envelopes in the mail. It had no return address, but it was sent from another state where I didn't know anyone from. When I opened it, it was simply a folded sheet of computer paper with a picture of Linus from Charlie Brown holding a heart and his blanket. It appeared to be drawn and colored by hand. On the inside was a short Valentine's Day message with a small personal detail about my life that only someone close to me would know. Naturally, I thought it was probably my grandparents or my parents trying to do something nice for me. Every year, it had a picture of Linus, included a detail about my life, was typed in the same font, and was from a different state. For example, the Valentine's Day after I adopted my dog Bailey, the card said, "Would Bailey be jealous if you were my Valentine?" I kept most of these, and managed to find a few as I was rummaging through old, worthless junk. When I got older, I finally mentioned it to my grandparents, fully expecting it to be them, but they swore that they weren't the ones sending the cards. I honestly believe it, because I had expressed my concerns by this point, and they aren't the type that want to scare me. Neither are my parents. The only other family I have in the US are my dad's parents, who don't speak English well and have never owned a computer. They had immigrated here, and there was no way for them to know people in so many states. Aside from my parents and my brother, who found it strange as well, I have no other family. I still get these cards every year, always the same except for one Valentine's Day a few years ago. I received a stuffed teddy bear and a big chocolate heart along with the card. Needless to say, I did not eat the chocolate, and I searched that bear, half convinced that there would be a hidden camera. After that year, I started just receiving the cards again. In any case, as a child, it was sort of exciting and mysterious, like a secret admirer. Now, it's just unnerving. I have racked my brain for years trying to find out who it could possibly be, and I have come up empty-handed. It still makes me uneasy, but if this person wanted to hurt me, I think that they would have done it by now. I've never felt outwardly threatened by them, so I don't think there's much that I can do about it. About a month ago, I started a new job doing security at a local community college. Being the new guy, I was pretty much shafted with the night shift right off the bat. Normally, I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekdays, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. on the weekends. It's a nice job, good pay, plenty of overtime. The campus doesn't have dorms, and I'm the only one here at night. It gets lonely and very quiet. Watching the security cameras is monotonous, and patrolling the empty dark halls can only be done for so long before boredom really starts to set in. When I first started, I had the expectation that I would be given the worst shift at the worst times, and I was right. I was put on the night schedule before I even got to see the place, really. It used to be an old Catholic academy for girls until the late 60s. It isn't particularly secluded, but more suburban. It sits up on a hill overlooking a highway. It has 5 floors in the new part of the building, 4 floors in the old convent and chapel wings. It was first opened in the 1890s by a religious order of nuns, particularly for young ladies who also wanted to be nuns. It grew out of that until eventually attendance dwindled and it was sold to the state, who in turn converted it into a community college after almost a decade of disrepair. I'm not someone who dabbles in the occult or knows a lot about the supernatural. I mind my own business and try to do my job. But recently, this place has got me in rare form. I don't scare easily now, but just in the short time that I have worked here, I've started to think that something is up. The security cameras are typical CCTV cameras, no audio recordings. But in the monitor, I'll hear a crackling like static. There's no way to enable or disable audio on the monitor. It comes and goes. I'll hear footsteps, like leather soles clopping down the hallways through the security monitor. When I go on patrols in the convent wing, the lockers that are typically reserved for the cleaning crew and faculty staff will be unlocked and wide open. I've seen them open on the cameras, but only my supervisor can play back the footage. Doors that I know I locked during my first patrol will then be unlocked and open on the third patrol. The motion sensors will detect something and turn on when I'm not even on that floor, and when I am, sometimes they don't even react to when I move down the hall. And when I go to what is now the library, it used to be the chapel, I can hear piano music coming from the hall where I had just came from. I don't really drink anymore. I don't do any drugs, prescribed or not. There's no history of mental illness, and this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm not sure how to tell my supervisor about it without sounding mad or cowardly. I don't even know if I'm posting this in the right area. Only 4 more hours left in my shift, anyway. This may have been a huge coincidence, but last January I applied for my grandfather's military service records. He died in 1981, way before I was born. I applied for his records and didn't think anything more of it. Several months went by, and I assumed that things were just moving slowly. 6 months later, without hearing any news of his records arriving, one night I had a very vivid dream. I don't often remember my dreams anymore. In my dream, I was in a very white, very bare room with high walls and a high ceiling. On a small table in front of me was a box, and inside was my grandfather's military service history. The dream simply revolved around my taking a good look through them, nothing too exciting. The next morning I wake up and remember the dream, maybe around an hour after I got up. 10 minutes later, a large envelope drops through my letterbox. It was my grandfather's service records. Odd? Just coincidence? A second, much stranger event occurred on the evening when my grandmother passed away. She had passed in the early morning and had been taken to the Chapel of Rest, which was not too far from the apartment where I was living. That evening, my parents invited me and my girlfriend for a dinner to celebrate her life. In the car, as we drove past the chapel, a leaf landed on the windscreen. The leaf was a perfect heart shape, upside down, so that the light from the streets illuminated the perfectness of the heart shape onto the car's dashboard. The leaf stayed on the windscreen for a minute or so, and right as we turned away and out of our town, it blew off and back toward the chapel itself. I do have a video of the leaf and the heart on the windshield. For a while afterward, shuffling footsteps and noises kept occurring in my parents' house, and they sounded exactly how my grandmother used to walk. We all heard them moving across the upstairs landing. After around 2 weeks, it stopped, and has never happened since. Odd, strangely comforting, and food for thought for a semi-skeptic who finds the subject of the paranormal fascinating. My wife and I were camping last night in Blue River Reservoir in Oregon. We camp here often and decided to explore up FSR 520 and found a cool, abandoned bridge far back in the woods over Cook Creek. The spot was beautiful and we were set up over the river on this long, abandoned bridge. If you've ever been in the Oregon woods, you know that they can give off a creepy vibe, and this was no exception. But it really was a dream campsite. Being 40 feet directly over a river while on a bridge with limbs growing everywhere over it isn't your everyday spot. I'll throw in for background that there was no one within at least 3 miles of us, and we had to hike our way in, approximately 1/10 of a mile from where we had parked. We explored around the area for a bit, and didn't come across anything out of the ordinary besides a pair of shoes and a name, Mona, written in ash on a rock of the fire ring. While we were sitting by the fire, I noticed a very bright flash of light over the river and snapped my head up, but didn't see anything. A few moments later, I was paying closer attention and watched a ball of light float, even with the bridge 40 feet in the air, from one side to the other in the woods over 50 feet. The light was very blue. My thought at first had been somehow that headlights had come through, but I would have heard a car and no man-made light could get to us in this isolated area. This blue light was unlike anything I had ever seen. I mentioned it to my wife, but didn't want to freak her out, so I dropped the subject soon after. Later that night in the tent, we had the mesh lining up where we could see outside. My wife gasped and watched as the same blue light floated at the end of the bridge 30 feet away and hovered in the air. After a good bit of time, it shot off into the woods. It being late at night, we were obviously scared of someone's headlamp, but it shot away 40 times as quickly as any human could go, and we saw nothing attached. Our dog left the tent and stared at that exact spot for the next 10+ minutes, while also peeking down the side of the bridge very seriously. When I was in high school, I lived in a really small town in Texas. It was the kind of place where everyone was either related or hated each other. I had no family tree there, so yeah. But I did have a pretty blonde girlfriend, and was pretty hated for that too. Nothing major, just petty harassment and occasional fights, but it had been escalating. So that's why on Valentine's Day, my girlfriend and I decided to skip the school dance and just stay in and watch a movie at her house while her parents went out. Just better to avoid trouble. We borrowed her dad's car, a little Honda Hatchback, and went into town. We stopped at the video store for a movie and went to the Dairy Queen for some ice cream, and then headed home. Now she lives in the complete boonies, out in the middle of the woods along a long, lonely road with no street lights. We're chatting, eating our blizzards, when all of a sudden a car comes up behind us. No big deal. What was a very big deal was that when the headlights flooded the interior of our car, I saw 2 hands on the back seat and a head coming from the hatchback part of the vehicle. As soon as the lights hit, the head and hands retreated back down. A solid chill ran through the entire length of my body. I slowly reached down and pulled out my pocket knife, which was the only thing I had. She saw me and asked what was wrong. Loudly, I said, "Nothing, I just have to stop at my friend's house real quick." She knew that was crap. I didn't have any friends. I pulled over at the next house that came up and jumped out of the car, yelling at her to jump out too. She popped out in total confusion. I flipped the driver's seat forward and lunged into the back seat in full maniac mode. This guy popped up like a jack-in-the-box, with empty hands waving around saying, hey, what are y'all up to tonight? It was some strange kid from our high school who we had never in our entire lives spoken to before. Ever. I said, "What in the holy hell are you doing in our car?" His reply was, "I thought you guys were going to the dance and I was just hitching a ride." We sat there staring at him with our mouths open, wondering what to do. He tried to act real cool, and obviously we were in the middle of nowhere in some random person's driveway, so whatever he was planning was totally forgotten. We actually ended up driving him to the dance and dropping him off. The whole time he's telling us to come inside with him. Yeah, no. We dropped his ass off and noped out of there as soon as we could. After he got out of the car, my girlfriend started crying and shaking. She was so freaked out. I have no idea what he was trying to do when the lights caught him crawling out of that hatchback. I hated that high school. I work at a mental health facility. Strange things happen a lot, like doors closing and opening, seeing things out of the corner of your eye. You know, normal, creepy hospital stuff. Well, I had the creepiest experience. One night about a year ago, I'm working on the adolescent unit, night shift. I just saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Then immediately afterward, this girl comes running out of her room screaming that the devil comes at 3:33. She's just repeating it over and over again. We get her some meds, and she goes back to sleep. The next night, it happens again. This time I look back at the clock, and it is in fact 3:33. They don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there's no way that she knew what time that it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. So this girl does this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. During that time, the quote-unquote creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen even more. Random door buzzers were going off, doors were opening and closing, lights were flickering. That creepy being watched, hair sticking up on your neck feeling was happening all the time. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. About a week afterward, she got transferred to a long-term facility. I get called to receive a report for a patient that was being sent to us. I'm reading through the notes, and at the very end, quote-unquote, parents report patient repeatedly says that the devil comes at 3:33. I check the name to see if it's the same girl. It wasn't. I called the on-call physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened. When I was a kid, I used to go to summer camp every year. It was one of the things I really looked forward to, since I loved camping. One year, I had a particularly weird experience that was one of those situations which was both scary and in some ways kind of funny when looked back upon years later. When I was 14, I was assigned to a cabin with several other boys, like in other years. A couple I knew from past years, a few I didn't. One particular boy was a guy named Wade. He was kind of off, in an almost but not quite nerdy way, like the kind of guy who liked to play sports but also liked D&D and would fire off random trivia. He was there with his fraternal twin brother, but because of some snafu on the part of the camp, they had been assigned to different cabins, even though siblings who were close in age were normally assigned to the same cabin, barring a specific request otherwise. We had bunk beds in the cabins, and each chose our bed early on. As fate would have it, I got the bottom bunk, and Wade wound up on the top. That night, when it came time for bed, we all turned in. I had a bit of trouble falling asleep, still being a bit wound up from getting to be at camp again. About 20 minutes or so after we'd all gotten into bed, the unmistakable sounds of a guy masturbating started coming from the bunk above me. Now, at that age I masturbated too, so I wasn't one to hold it against anyone else for doing the same thing, but Wade was, well, not really going to town, but he was making no effort to keep quiet about what he was doing. He went on for several minutes before rather obviously reaching his, climax, after which things got quiet again and I soon fell asleep. The next morning, after we were all up and making our beds, I noticed that Wade was the only one not around, so I made an admittedly crude joke to the other guys about how he'd really been having fun the previous night. The others all looked at me in confusion, and one asked what I meant. I commented once again about how Wade had been quote-unquote pleasuring himself rather loudly after we were all in bed, making a gesture of masturbating. Everyone still looked puzzled, and I said, "Surely at least one of you must have heard Wade getting his rocks off." After a moment, one of the other boys said that at the last minute, another camper in Wade's brother's cabin had canceled, and since a spot was thus available in that cabin, Wade had moved over there the previous afternoon. He'd never even slept in our cabin. Baffled, I looked up at the top bunk to see just the bare mattress, and glancing down to where Wade had dropped his stuff the previous morning, I noticed that his stuff was gone. I was now as confused as everyone else had been a few moments before. If Wade had never been up there, then who had been masturbating above me the night before? The other boys laughed and accused me of dreaming the whole thing. But when I later mentioned it to one of the counselors there, he grew quiet for a few moments before saying that there had been a story going around the camp for many years of a teenage boy who had drowned, and whose bed had been the one above mine. As the story went, his ghost supposedly haunted that cabin, but the counselor, like many other people, had always dismissed it as nothing more than a story told around the campfire, until now. Granted, I don't know that I hadn't actually fallen asleep and just dreamed the whole thing, just like my cabin mates had accused me of doing. I know it sounds absurd. Who ever heard of a masturbating teenage ghost? But it seemed so real, I'm sure that I was wide awake when it happened. About 3 years ago, I went camping with my now ex-girlfriend, as she had always expressed interest, but had never actually been. The spot we went to is in the Huron National Forest, and is my go-to trail camping spot, as it's hidden deep in the forest, and the access trail is close and easy to get to, for ATVs, etc. My family has been going to this spot for about 6 years, and my friends that introduced me about 10 or so years. We went for a weekend trip, and I'm glad we didn't go any longer. When we got there, everything was going well, except we did notice a group of people that were hanging out next to our campsite, but they were just stargazing, and soon they left. Then around midnight is when the weird stuff started to happen. At first, it sounded like someone was laughing at us, but the laugh never ended, and got very high-pitched as it just kept going. After a while, we both got kinda scared and went into the tent to try and sleep, and that's when the laughter/noise moved up higher, and then started to circle the campsite. After a while of that happening, it just suddenly stopped, and then started again around 3 a.m. When it started again, the fire was going out, so I went to stoke it with my shotgun in hand, and turned on my flashlight to see if maybe I could see any coyotes or something around the campsite, but I didn't see anything or hear any movement. This went on until 6 a.m. and then stopped, and then finally we were able to get some rest. After we woke up, we checked around the camp and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so we packed up. Once we were packed up and good to go, I tried to start my vehicle, and it was completely dead. That really freaked me out, as I'm always paranoid about leaving things plugged in that kill the battery and make sure that everything was closed. Yet somehow, the battery still died. I was able to get a jump from AAA. After that happened, I told my friend, who had shown me the campsite and also has a cabin in the same forest, roughly 25 miles away from that particular campsite, about what happened, and he got freaked out. He told me about 2 incidents, one at the campsite and one at his cabin. At the campsite, he stated that one night after we had all returned from trail riding and went to bed, he stayed up to hang out by the fire and have a few drinks. While he was hanging out, he was just looking off into the distance and saw a pair of eyes up in the trees looking directly at him. He described them as being bioluminescent. He flashed his high-powered flashlight at them, but there was nothing there, and as soon as the flashlight turned off, there they were again, looking right back at him. So he packed up and went right to bed. He didn't tell us because he didn't want to scare us. At the cabin, he was hanging out with his brother, and they were both just chilling by the fire outside, when again they saw a pair of eyes looking at them from a trail that leads into the woods. They stated that at the height the eyes were looking at them from, whatever it was, had to be 7 foot plus tall. They started shooting at it with their rifles, and the eyes disappeared, but once they were gone, they reappeared and were closer. At that point, they were both freaked out and got back into the cabin and did not leave until daylight. We have no idea what this could have been, but all felt very scared when these events were happening. After we talked about it, one of the brothers thinks it's a Wendigo. I don't really know what that could be, but I haven't been that terrified since. I'm going to tell about my experience, but for certain reasons I will not be naming anyone specifically. It was 2014. I was 13 years old at the time, and my great-grandmother was in a nursing home as her mental health had started to slip and as my great-aunt and uncle couldn't take care of her anymore. I remember the last time that I had seen her in person. It was a sunny January afternoon, and me, my parents, grandparents, and my aunt and uncle had decided to talk outside as opposed to the sad, depressing clinical interior of the nursing home. Despite my great-grandmother having memory issues, she recognized me right away and told me specifically hello. It's March of 2014, and during the night, I'm having memory flashbacks of things that me and my great-grandmother used to do, like stringing long strands of old-fashioned buttons, or the time I had my first ever garden-grown tomato raw, sitting on the porch swing with her while my grandfather worked in the field. I remember waking up that morning and asking, almost demanding my mother to call the nursing home, or my great-aunt and uncle, and she called them while I took a shower. After I got done, my mother informed me that my grandmother had indeed passed away from old age. I spent the rest of the day walking around our house in an almost trance-like state. About 5 years ago, I had just moved into a new house with my wife at the time. We had 2 kids, ages 2.5 and 1. My 2.5-year-old was very articulate for his age, and so one day as we were walking out the front door, he points across the house and asks, "Mommy, who's that little girl right there?" Well, my wife and I just kind of froze, because he was the kind of kid that had never made up any imaginary friends, or anything like that. But the moment passed, and we kind of forgot about it. Around 6 to 8 months later, I remember I was in my bedroom late at night. I have a large window in my bedroom that looks out into my backyard. I also had a couple strings of lights overhead that illuminated the yard perfectly. One night I was up studying for a class the next day when I looked outside and saw that my kid's swing set had one swing going back and forth in a perfect pendulum motion like someone was on it, while the swing next to it was dead still. This was not the first time this has happened. It was actually the third, I think. But it was the instance that I remember the most clearly and took the most notice. I honestly have no idea why I didn't think to tell my wife or to take a video, but I just stood there in the window and watched it for a couple minutes, and it kept up perfect consistency. I grabbed my flashlight and walked out to my deck to get a better look. Still swinging. I had been studying lots of science classes at that point, so my head was in the space of, I'm going to figure out the rational explanation of why this is happening. It was breezy out, so I walked up to the swing set and held my hand in different places around the swinging swing, and no breeze. Plus, again, the swing next to it was dead still. Also, my thought was that if it was the wind, there was no way that it could keep a perfect back and forth motion. If a swing gets even a little off, it would have collided with the one next to it. Anyway, I'm not sure if I had a previous encounter with my son in mind or not, but I had a very certain feeling at that moment that there was a little girl swinging on the swing. Almost like I could see her, but obviously couldn't. I also felt very at ease and not frightened at all. Then after about 5 to 10 minutes, I stopped the swing just to see what would happen, and it remained stopped. I remembered apologizing out loud to the girl for stopping the swing, and told her that she could swing whenever she wanted to, but it never happened again after that, and I haven't had any additional encounters at this house since. I looked up public records and asked the landlord if there was ever any little girl that had died in this house, and nothing. The only info that I could collect is that a few years before we moved in, there was an elderly woman who lived here for about 20 years, but the owner had the landlord kick her out in fear that she would die on the property, so she had to move in with family a few states away. Anyways, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. My boyfriend and I were big fans of nautical history, so we decided to spend our Valentine's Day in 2007 on the Queen Mary. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it's reported to be haunted. That was also the kind of thing that appealed to us, but mostly we have BAs in European history, so it was just cool in general. Anyhow, we got a historical suite, meaning that it was mostly like it had been when the ship was commissioned aside from an old TV. The first night, Valentine's Day night, when we stayed there, we both woke up to what sounded like the drawers of the built-in dresser being opened and slammed shut repeatedly. We're both not the types to freak out and run, but I can't really say why we were both so low-key that we just acknowledged that the other was okay and eventually went back to sleep. Mainly because it was truly alarming at the time. Maybe we just trusted that if we were both okay, that everything else was okay? I really don't know. But then, we didn't know the history about the room. The next day, we went on the ghost tour. Turns out that we were sleeping in the second most haunted room on the ship. The room next door was Churchill's suite, where he planned battles during World War II. While we didn't experience the cigar smell that many have reported while staying in that room, it was still interesting that without knowing our room was known to have paranormal events happen, we did have an experience. We had some really weird camera malfunctions in the engine room, as well as creepy, aggressive feelings in an old museum room on the ship, which we only found because we tried to get into every unlocked room that there was. It honestly felt like someone was creeping up behind our backs. But again, just feelings, so shrug. Anyway, that's my Valentine's Day ghost story. The first and only time I've ever seen a ghost, a dead person, a demon, whatever you want to call it, was exactly 1 year ago today. I had just gotten my bachelor after 3 years of studying social welfare and was now working at a group home for teens with substance use problems. My workplace was in a big old house, which was almost scary quiet during the nighttime, and I often felt anxious being there. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the job and spending time with the teens, but working nights scared the crap out of me. I usually started my shift around 8 p.m. Around that time, we often made dinner. I helped out with homework, and we talked for hours, dealing with all sorts of issues until I went to bed, usually around 1 a.m., and this was one of those days. I fell asleep at 1:30, woke up 2 hours later like I usually do to get a glass of water. I walked down the stairs, entered the common room, and then walked by a big window in the living room. I looked up at the gray, cloudy sky when I saw death hanging in a tree. Brown, rotten flesh in the shape of a face. I rubbed my eyes and then looked again, and the flesh was still there. I couldn't move, breathe, or blink my eyes for a few seconds. I was absolutely terrified. After a while, I found the strength to move my legs and walked into the office again. I locked the door and sat there all night, and when the sun finally peeked out, I managed to move my legs to go and look out the window again. There was no rotten flesh this time, just a normal tree with green leaves. A few days later after this incident, I told my boss that I didn't want to work night shifts anymore since the lack of sleep. I didn't want to tell her the real reason, since she would probably think that I was mad. Maybe I was. And what if this was just a nightmare? Probably. But what if it wasn't? I remember around 12 years ago, when I was around 11 or 12, I stayed over at my grandmother's a lot to keep her company after my grandfather passed away. I was lying in bed one night. I had just turned the TV off to go to sleep when I heard a creaking sound outside the door, but I just thought it was Grandma going to the bathroom since she had to walk past my room to get there. Then, I heard the handle being pulled down, and again I just thought it was my grandma, maybe just coming in to say goodnight before bed. As I looked toward the door, I saw a large, white hand grip the edge of the door, and instantly I knew it wasn't her. I was too terrified to say or do anything, so I just kept watching as the door slowly opened. Because of the window at the top of the stairs outside the room, there was just enough light from the streetlights outside coming through to see what it was. It was a tall, slightly transparent figure. It just stood in the doorway for what could have been seconds or minutes, or who really knows how long. I couldn't look away, and I refused to shut my eyes, even to blink, but of course, I had to eventually, and once I blinked, the figure was gone, with only the open door as proof that it wasn't my imagination. To this day, I still don't know what it was. I told my friends before, and they said it could have been my grandfather's ghost, but it was way too tall and skeletal looking to be my grandfather in my opinion, and I felt a deep, sinister feeling from it that couldn't be further from the warm, loving person that my grandfather had been. I've had a few odd experiences with things before that I could chalk up to imagination or overreacting, but as they say, you have to see it to believe it. And after that day, I certainly believe. Ever since, it's had me wondering what else could be out there. When I was around 5, I went camping with my parents in a place called Bear Creek Reservoir. Because it's a very isolated place deep in the woods, we got there by driving up an old logging road. The actual reservoir itself was very beautiful and quiet. I actually looked up the area on Google Maps, and it still gives me the chills, even looking at it from a satellite perspective, but anyways. So the day passed by without incident. We mostly just swam the whole day away, and then went to bed. But the following morning I woke up in my parents' tent, just as the sun was making its appearance. I unzipped the tent, and noticed a figure, standing maybe 50 feet away. The light was still fairly dim, so it was hard to make out distinct details, but the thing was just standing there staring at me, unmoving. The entity had the figure of a woman of average size, but instead of seeing a face, there was just darkness. But I could just sense that it was indeed looking at me. And instead of clothes and skin, it had leaves and sticks, as if it were made from them. I remember feeling very afraid of this creature, like if I had left the tent, I wouldn't have been seen again kind of fear. So I tried waking up my parents, and they were both really pissed that I woke them up that early and didn't believe me at all until they finally got up later and explored the area. We ended up finding a bunch of man-made structures, branches, and other weird stuff in the surrounding area. Happy Valentine's Day weekend to everyone. Not a lot of romance happening in the Gribble house, but we did have a lot of action. On Sunday evening this past week, a pair of childhood friends named Katie and Lauren investigated with us. The two girls had a mutual friend that had passed away when they were kids, named Lauren. As they investigated, they could hear her name being said through the ghost box. Several times in a row, and all over the warehouse. The girls told our lead investigator, Kelly, that she had been to see a psychic in the past and had been told that her deceased friend Lauren was definitely with her. Another group investigating on Sunday night were using the Ovilus on dictionary mode, and they had both the Ovilus and the spirit box say, "Save her," twice in a row. While Kelly was seated in the slave quarters with several guests who were investigating, they heard from a spirit named Anthony and his wife, as well as a child spirit named Will. Tuesday night was great as well. The ghost box and ghost meters were the star of the show that night. A ton of different names came through, like Adam, Helen, Tom, Meredith, and of course, Paul. Paul was his regular charming self, and called one of the investigators as Fat Ass. One of the women investigating asked, "Why would you say such a thing?" To which she got the response of his laughter through the ghost box. Paul was fairly cooperative that night, actively communicating through the ghost box with several groups of guests. However, when they requested that he do things like touch their hands or move the EMF detectors, his response was simply no. We got some amazing EVPs that night through the ghost boxes. One group investigating asked a spirit if they were nice, to which they got the response, "What do you want?" Another group got a sinister response from their questions. They asked a spirit named Tom, who told them that he was the one who killed Meredith and the lady by the door. The investigation on Friday night went great as well. Orbs were everywhere, as well as EMF and ghost meter action. Don't forget about the Raggedy Ann doll. Several times during the evening, she lit up from head to toe, not just the hands or feet separately. One man investigating told a female spirit that he was communicating with that if anything or anyone decided to follow him home that evening, that he would be very ticked off. The only response that he got to that was laughter through the ghost box, along with the word clown. Another group was using the spirit box, and ended up conversing with a soldier from the Revolutionary War who answered questions about the battle through the ghost meter. The battle was the Siege of Savannah. A few children were heard from Friday night as well. One little box told the investigators that his name was Leo. When they said goodbye to Leo for the night, the right hand of the Raggedy Ann doll lit up. Over near the residual haunting area, they could hear children's giggles through the spirit box. When Kelly was leaving the warehouse for the night, she thought that she could see an older man standing inside the gated area of the Gribble house. Needless to say, she left with chills that evening. Last night, on Valentine's Day, we had 2 separate investigations. During the first, the Raggedy Ann doll had some very interesting action. While seated in the slave quarters, everyone investigating was focused on the doll, just as the doll moved all on its own. A little child named Wendy was heard from the spirit box in the slave quarters as well, and the REM pod lit up with small touches. As the guests were leaving the warehouse from the first hour, a few of them were looking back into the building and swore that they saw 2 women entering the area by the bathroom, but no one was there. During the second investigation, a group of 2 saw a black shadow figure moving along the Gribble house walls, accompanied by a dramatic drop in temperature as well as whispers and strange noises. Yet another great week of investigation at the Gribble House Paranormal Experience. For a little background, my mother has been in a long-term nursing facility since March with some serious but stable health issues. Then there was a virus outbreak in her facility, and she was diagnosed with it. I of course worried for her condition as she began to decline rather quickly over the beginning of last week. Last Wednesday, I switched off my light at 10 p.m. like most nights, rolled over, and began to doze off. Typically when I'm dozing, my mind will follow some random train of thought that will lead me off into snooze land. That night, as I was dozing, I envisioned my mother walking into my late father's arms, being hugged by my older brother who had died 9 years ago, and having my grandparents and aunt gather around her while being hugged by my father. Then the phone woke me up at 10:30 p.m. The hospice nurse called to tell me that my mother had passed away at 10:15. I like to think that I was seeing her entry into heaven, with my family's love and long-missed affection return to bring her to happiness. I work night shift on a unit at a nursing home. I hear and see a lot of weird things, but nothing much with meaning. Me and the other aide were walking down my hall to go check on a fall risk resident when we got in front of the door to an empty room that stays locked. The resident had moved home and no one had been in there since mid-October. I heard 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the room on the door as soon as we walked by. I froze and turned around, and without speaking looked at my friend, waiting for her to say if she had heard it as well, and when she did, I was frozen in fear, knowing that I was not alone in hearing things. Lots of little extra things have also happened. Me and another aide walked by a room when we got bad vibes. It was cracked open an inch, and the door slammed shut suddenly, so hard that it shook the floor. Right next to the room with the knocks, we had a resident pass away. Again, me and an aide walked by. The door was closed and locked, and the handle started jiggling hard and fast. Another time, me and an aide heard snarling growls coming from the dining room all night. The same night when the knocks occurred. There were also instances of running faucets in the residents' bathrooms, in the basement, anywhere that I went, had a resident complaining of water running all night. I was in a nearby abandoned Navy hospital with several friends. We had been in many times before and never had anything odd happen. We were on the top, the third floor, and there were many broken windows, allowing the rain and nature in. There was a lot of mold and even moss growing in the old ceiling tiles that covered the floor at this point. One of our group, prone to asthma and respiratory issues, didn't take it too well. We all decided it was best to leave and began our descent into the basement, which was the route to the exit. This is when things got weird. I broke ahead of the group, something generally against our rules of exploring, but in my mind I had to get out. I was far enough ahead, around corners and such, that I couldn't even see their flashlights behind me anymore. My heart was racing, and I still don't know why. I finally got to the last door that led to the room that we would exit from. It was a heavier door that closed by itself. I reached for the doorknob, but something stopped me. I couldn't do it. Something in my mind wasn't letting me put my hand on the knob. All I felt was terror. I'm not sure how long I stood there, shaking with my hand no more than 3 inches away, before I saw the flashlights of my friends at the end of the hallway, and at last I could do it. I wrenched the door open and immediately went outside, hyperventilating with panic. My friends soon joined me, also saying something felt a little weird in there that time. We were gathering outside the door when the friend with the breathing issues felt something on her shoulder. We pulled down her shirt and there was a noticeable, quite obvious handprint. Nobody touched her, especially not hard enough to leave a full handprint through clothing. We've been back several times and haven't had another experience in any way, which only makes it even more odd, if you ask me. This happened February 14th, Valentine's Day. Me and 2 of my friends decided that we would get a cheap hotel room and take some LSD to kick off the loneliest holiday ever. I've done it before, but was not in a good mindset to take it that night, so I settled for a bottle of wine. Anyway, we weren't familiar with the area of the hotel, but it was cheap, and that's all that mattered to us. It was around 3 in the morning, and outside the door we hear someone stumbling around, bumping into the walls. But it was Valentine's Day anyway, so we just brushed it off as a drunk couple on their way to get it on. The stumbling stopped and went silent right outside of our door. My friends are tripping at this point, and I'm pretty drunk. We hear this woman start sobbing outside, and I'm assuming that she sat down with her back on our door because we heard her slide down the wall and collapse right on the other side. The woman starts trying to speak to us through the cracks of the door, saying that she lost her dogs and was wondering if we could help her. It was 3 a.m., and we didn't know anything about the area, like I said, so common sense would dictate don't respond. And we didn't. The woman then proceeds to bang on the door, saying that we stole her dogs, and that she's gonna come in and quote-unquote effing murder us. She was scratching and banging on the door for 10 minutes straight, and then just stopped. My friends were starting to have a bad trip because of her, but when she stopped, I tried to reassure them that she was gone and that they could go back to having a good time. To prove it to my friends, I checked through the peephole to verify that this woman was indeed gone. But there she was, trying to stare right back at me through the other side of the peephole. I watched her as she stepped back and stood there, as still and solid as a literal concrete statue. She had her eyes right on mine. I doubt that she could see me through the peephole, but I was making dead eye contact with her. The woman then proceeds to start screaming and throwing her body against the door, which thankfully woke up our neighbors and they called the front desk. The woman behind the front desk comes and tries to get this woman to leave. The woman left, but was going down the walkways of the hotel being loud and refusing to actually leave the property. She was still crying out for her lost dogs in the hotel hallway at 3 a.m. They said that they never saw her leave, and implied that she was still inside, so they just told me to keep an eye out for her and call the front desk if anything else happened. The police were called, and stayed posted outside the hotel for an extra 30 minutes, and then left. It turns out that she was on some really heavy drugs. But still, hearing this woman throw her body onto the door, saying that she would kill us, was incredibly traumatizing. We left early that morning, and never went back. Ever since we moved to our new house, I hear someone playing in my son's room when he's outside. Generally, I just wrote it off as something he placed precariously that just fell or something, and then I saw it. Or her, rather. I was sitting on my couch talking with the wife about whatever we were going on about, and when I turned my head back to look at my wife, I saw a little blonde girl in a white dress peeking around the corner of our hall entrance that leads to my son's upstairs room. I immediately asked my wife if she saw it, but of course she was looking at me when it happened. It was basically right behind her. Just the other day I heard what I thought was my wife calling out, "Hey!" as she was doing laundry. I got up to see what she wanted, and she had no idea what I was talking about, and said that she didn't say anything. And she didn't hear anything either, even though the sound came from the area where she was, at the bottom of the stairs that lead to my son's room. Are there any Android apps or something that can help me communicate with the spirit that I believe is in this house? She seems playful. And sometimes I hear my son playing alone, talking to someone that isn't there, but when I ask him, he says he's just talking to his toys. It was 1999, and I worked night shift in a factory back in Puerto Rico. One night it was just QC and me working in a back dark room of the factory. About 2:30 a.m. I saw a door open, and a pale young lady stepped in and walked in our direction. QC was facing the other way, and I was looking at her from my workstation. I stood up, and that's when I noticed that from the waist down, the woman was blurred. She was dressed in a light blue dress and a cap. As she got closer, she vanished into a mist. I rubbed my eyes and called the QC. I told her what I had just seen, and she said, "It's just your imagination playing tricks." After an hour or so had passed, this tall, dark shape, dressed in a brown mechanic's outfit, got close to me, looking over my right shoulder. I could see it with the edge of my eyes. It wasn't touching the floor. I froze, petrified. For about 30 minutes, it kept moving forward and backward. I finished the work night and went home spooked. Next day I told my experience to everyone, and a mechanic who had worked there for years told me that when he stayed there, an old mechanic who had all kinds of issues was found hung in the same spot where I was working. When this happened, I was 9 years old, and camping out with 3 families other than my own. I was sleeping in a small tent with one of my closest friends when something woke me up. I listened and heard nothing from outside at first, so I opened the tent zipper enough to see the fire. It was out, so I knew the adults must have been asleep. I closed the zipper back and laid back down. Shortly afterward, I heard a high-pitched voice from outside the tent telling me to, quote-unquote, come out and play. I would have thought it was a person, but it was repeating itself over and over again, and moving close to the tent and then far away, all the time circling. I opened the tent and looked out, but it was pitch black. At this point, I tried to wake the friend, but he pushed me off. I tried again, more violently this time, and he woke up. I told him I heard something outside, but he must not have been fully awake because he just mumbled something and went back to sleep. I tried to go back to sleep myself, but the voice kept me up. I don't know when exactly, but somehow I finally did drift back off. The next morning, I told my friend who had been in the tent about it, and he said he remembered being annoyed that I woke him up. So to me, that means that I wasn't dreaming. I'm certain that I was fully awake, so there's no way that I hallucinated what I was hearing. A few years ago, me and a buddy from the army decided to meet and catch up. We decided on the date and place. After several hours at the local pub, it was 3 a.m., we had 3 beers each and decided to go pay our respects to a friend of ours who had died a few years ago and was with us in the army. We bought a bottle of our friend's favorite booze and drove toward the graveyard. When we got there and started to walk toward the gate, we both saw someone standing there. As we got closer, I could definitely recognize the very friend that we were going to visit. He was standing there in his uniform holding a rifle and was waving at us to come closer. I was incredibly freaked out by what I was seeing. I just turned to my friend and looked at him and asked him if he was seeing the same thing. He was so shocked that he couldn't even talk and was just nodding his head with his mouth open. We backed away slowly and went back to the car and drove away as fast as we could from there. Where I'm from, they say never go close if you see the dead calling you over. But ever since that day, I keep hearing someone call my name behind me when I'm all alone. At first I thought it was my wife messing with me, but that's not possible, because it's a male voice. Once again, I'm really freaking out. A few times I left my phone recording on all night to prove to my wife that I'm not going insane. But every time I do it, there's zero evidence. Just static and me and my wife snoring in the background. Before I begin my story, I'll give you a quick summary of the location where this happened. At my middle school, in the other half of the building built in the 1950s at some point. All the classrooms have little windows next to them. My reason for bringing this up is a horrifying event that took place during my 5th class today involving one of these said windows. I walked into the classroom and set my stuff down, preparing to ask the boy next to me named Cameron if he had a pencil. As I was about to open my mouth, I heard a loud smacking sound followed by a crunch, followed by a shattering type noise. Sort of like when you drop a box of pencils or markers. All of a sudden, I was deafened by screams of shock and agony. My classmates were now in the hall, shocked by something just barely out of my line of sight. I walked into the hallway with them. Being on the shorter end of the height spectrum, I had to shove my way to the front of the group. What I saw next will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. I saw a girl rolling around on the floor, smearing blood on the dirty linoleum tiles. At first I couldn't tell what happened, but I got the picture after a few seconds. This girl was a special needs student. After being rejected by a boy in her class, she went completely ballistic and without thinking had punched one of the windows next to a neighboring classroom's door. There was broken glass and blood everywhere. Thankfully, the classroom next to ours is vacant, and no one was in there at the time of the incident. After about 10 minutes, teachers got the situation calmed down. The girl was completely insane and tried to fight the man who came to help her. The school ended up going into a lockdown. She had to go to the hospital, and even though no one really knew her, we were all in legitimate shock by the horrible scene. I really hope that she's getting the help she needs, and hope that she doesn't have a fistful of glass shards. I've seen some really crazy things at my school, but that might have been the most messed up thing I've ever witnessed. My mom and grandma have had similar experiences with premonitions, but I am now 21 and have been having them for the first time in my own life recently. A few weeks ago, I had a very vivid dream about my childhood best friend who I haven't seen or spoken to in years, and I woke up the next day to find out that she had committed suicide. Then this past week, I told my boyfriend that I missed our old coworker, who we also haven't seen or spoken to in a few years. And come to find out, he suddenly dropped dead about 15 minutes before I had made that comment. Today I took a nap and had another very vivid dream, very lucid, about my high school boyfriend. And now I'm a little bit freaked out, and I'll definitely be watching his social media over the coming days, hoping that this has just been a weird coincidence.